discussion room. My name is Maria Levchenko. Today I'll be your moderator, and I represent a couple of different organizations. I am European Director of Outreach and Training for River Phoenix Center for Peace Building, but I also work as a Peace Building Officer for Patria, and it's a big honor and pleasure to be here today to moderate the event and to facilitate the conversation. So hopefully it will be a very fruitful discussion. And depending where you are, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I know that we have participants from all over the world. So I'm quite happy to see such a diverse group who are really passionate about the peace building, but also the cause of the violence and the ways and how to solve it. So with no further ado, I think we'll start now. As I said, my name is Maria Levchenko. I'll be the moderator of the event. And today I'll kindly ask everyone to mute your microphone so that we'll be able to hear the speakers once they will present. And in the light of the current affairs, where the conflicts and violence continue to threaten the very fabric of our society, it's really crucial that we all come together to address these pressing issues. And today we hope that our global webinar on tackling the war in Ukraine and the rising global violence will serve as a platform where we can actually try to understand more the root causes of these conflicts and explore the strategies for peace and stability. The full-scale invasion in Ukraine started by Russia has been a devastating war and significant humanitarian consequences. It's representative of the larger global trend of escalating violence and threats to peace. And now, more than ever, it's really important for us to globally, collectively tackle these challenges head-on and seek sustainable solutions that can transcend the borders and confront the deeper systematic issues that perpetuate the violence. Today, through the event, we'll have the opportunity to hear from esteemed speakers, experts, and practitioners who have dedicated their time and expertise to peace-building efforts, and their commitment to finding peaceful resolutions and promoting stability underscores the urgency of the situation. I also wanted to mention that we acknowledge the importance of hearing Ukrainian voices and recognize that Ukrainian voices are central to understanding the complexities of the conflict in Ukraine. And as a Ukrainian myself, I know it's the most important to hear our perspective. However, through Peace Support Ukraine, we have worked tirelessly to raise awareness and to provide a platform for Ukrainian speakers to share their insights and experience. And today, in our continued pursuit of comprehensive understanding, we also believe that it's essential to create a space to learn from international experiences. So by engaging with the experts from all around the world, we aim to foster a collective dialogue that will contribute to a deeper understanding and provide available perspectives and strategies for peace building and conflict resolution. So our intention is not to overshadow the voices of those who are directly affected, but rather to foster a global conversation that can help us to develop a holistic approach in addressing the challenges faced in Ukraine, but also beyond. Today, with the presentations from esteemed speakers and insights, we'll gain a deeper understanding of the initiatives and projects being undertaken to mitigate the war in Ukraine and enhance peace and security in Europe. Each speaker will bring their unique perspectives and recommendations, allowing us to explore a broad range of approaches to conflict resolution. We are not limited to a specific case of Ukraine. The second speaker session today will delve into a broader context of rising global violence, and we will explore how we can collectively move beyond the war. And our experts will provide their perspectives and recommendations on strengthening peace and stability worldwide, shedding light on practical steps that we can take to address conflicts and promote harmony. Through our discussions today, let us remember that we are confronted with the responsibility not only to understand the challenges that we face, but also to translate that into meaningful action. And by fostering collaboration and encouraging open dialogue, we can collectively drive the change and make tangible progress in achieving sustainable peace. I want to express my sincere appreciation to our speakers, experts, and participants for joining us today. Your presence demonstrates your commitment to promoting peace and stability in the world that so desperately needs it. And together, I believe that we will make a lasting impact and pave the way for a more peaceful and prosperous future. So with no further ado, we will start with the first speaker session, which is labeled The War in Ukraine, a Peace-Building Response, the Future and Peace and Security Architecture in Europe. In the first speaker session, we'll have opportunity to ask Q&A So after each speaker presentation, you're more than free to post your question in the chat box. And then when we have time, we'll be able to address those. And of course, if you have any comments or remarks, you're also more than welcome to post them in the chat box. So our first speaker for today is Katarzyna Anna Przybua, and I hope I pronounce your last name right. As a Ukrainian, hopefully I got it. So Katarzyna is the head and creator of Strategic Peace and Conflict Studies program run by College Civitas and the United Nations Institute for Training and Research, UNITAR. She also serves as the associate editor of the academic journal Peace Review. She was a Fulbright scholar at the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies in the academic year 2014-2015. In 2018, Marshall Memorial Fellow, and from 2018 to 21, she worked as a director of analysis and senior editor in the Analytical Center. Earlier, for almost 8 years, she worked at the National Security Bureau of Poland, focusing on the former Soviet Union, NATO-Russia relations, and international peace and security organizations. Katarzyna, the floor is yours. And yeah, I hope everyone will communicate in the chat box.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, first of all, for the invitation. I feel really honored that I can be here among so many excellent speakers. I have a short presentation, so I will share my screen with you. Just let me know if you see it.
It comes through clearly. Thank you, Katarzyna.
Perfect. So I hope that everything will work well. Since I'm the first person speaking, I want to start with something big and general. I have been thinking about it for a long time now, and I want to share it with you. When I look at what is currently happening, I have this feeling that we are falling into the darkness, which I would call the war culture. What do I mean by that? So the governments, corporations, often international organizations are using the current conflict to really include or even militarize our reality. And what is worse, we stop noticing it. I mean, it's so common that not only we stop noticing it, but we also feel that is normal, that it's okay. And although the governments, corporations, they claim that they want to transform the conflict and make peace, what they are doing, they are incorporating war machine and the war thinking into our daily lives. So instead of moving towards sustainable peace, we are moving away from it. What do I have in mind? So what is this war culture? So first of all, what do we have? What we currently have, we have lots of discussions and the policy level actors focusing on military support and actions. So when you hear politicians, they talk in regards to Ukraine, they talk about military support. In their own countries, including Poland, they, for example, increase military spending. What else? Focusing on policy level, even among ourselves, when we have debates, panel discussions, many experts talk about policy level actions. So what governments, organizations are doing, what politicians are doing. The third element of it is, in general, talking war or talking security. What it means that we often use security as an excuse for actions of the governments, but also we use war language. So we change even our daily conversations and we include words connected to war into regular conversations that we have. And we focus on short term. And we focus on the short term, not just at the policy level. So in regards to Ukraine, what should be done today and tomorrow, how to counter the attack, what to do in a week. But also when we look at media, for example, when we fight propaganda, we just focus on today. So a certain news how to explain that it's not true, and without thinking about the future, the long term. So this is the war culture. So what is missing here? What is missing here, there are two things: peace perspective and people, which is really ironic, especially the last one, because on the ground, there are people fighting for their future and for their lives, often. So, war. Where does it start? War, as well as peace, starts here, in your mind. It does not start with a weapon. It doesn't start with your military budget. It doesn't start with the entire structure of your country. It starts here, in people's minds. There has to be an idea. There has to be this thinking, way of thinking, or ideology. In general, it starts within people's minds. So if we want to transform conflicts, if we want to make peace, we should spend a great deal of time focusing on minds and people. And you can see that I'm quite passionate here about it. And it's because when I attend conferences, when I talk to different experts, scholars, when I see talks at the policy level, these are the elements that are missing. And I'm not saying that what is being done is not okay. Supporting Ukraine is necessary. Talks about military support, about what has to be done today is necessary. But there are elements that are missing. And these elements, when they are missing, they are making this war culture even stronger. And this is a huge danger, not just for today, but for the future. So the topic of today's, or of this part, is thinking about the future of Europe, about peace perspectives. So what is missing? And what is necessary? And I will focus on things that I feel are missing, not necessarily of things that are out there and they are good. Because these are the things that we have in our discussions, we have during conferences, we have politicians talking about that. So what we need is a peace culture. And if we want to have peace culture, we have to focus on the mind. What does it mean? It means, for example, holistic support. At the beginning, when I showed you the same graph about talking about war culture, there was focus on military support. Whereas what is necessary is a holistic support, human-centered approach. So while you're increasing your military support, what is necessary to remember is, if the word starts here, that you have to increase money that is spent on education, on critical thinking skills, not just, in your own country, in my case, Poland, not just in Ukraine, but also in Russia, also in Belarus. Holistic support is not just supporting, for example, the army, but also supporting nonviolent movements. There are nonviolent movements in Ukraine. There are less visible nonviolent movements in Russia. There is a great nonviolent movement in Belarus. So holistic support is not just supporting one branch, but supporting actions that are taken. So this is a holistic support. Then focusing on all levels of society. When we have our talks, we often talk about, politicians' actions. If we want to make changes in the long term, if we want to have sustainable peace, we have to focus on all levels of society. Because what often works is not at the top level. These are the actions below the top level. And one of the examples is problem-solving workshops, including experts. So people, not necessarily at the top level, but connected to it, but people also that can influence the grassroots level. This is missing, maybe it's happening and we don't know, because problem-solving workshops, these are the workshops that are often secret, but we even don't have talks about it or having such meetings. Talking peace about peace building, and this is a huge, maybe you can say, a message to media, newspapers, online outlets, but also us, experts and scholars. When we talk about what is happening and what is needed, we should include peace perspective, peace building actions. We are the ones responsible for showing what are the other options that we can add when we have the negotiating table, or a table with proposals, or a box, a toolbox with the tools that we can use. So we are responsible for adding peace perspective here, but also showing people that there are options other than they can see on the front page of a newspaper. It's ironic that we have more news about tanks than about people working at the grassroots level and local initiatives. And then focusing on both short-term and long-term. And this is crucial because short-term is up there. We are talking about it and it's necessary. Let me be clear here. And I know that what I'm talking about, I have to be really precise so that people don't misunderstood me. I'm not saying that we shouldn't focus on what's out there today and what we should do today. I'm saying that while we are talking about short term, we also have to think about a long-term perspective. What does it mean in the case of Ukraine? For example, there are lots of people experiencing traumas in Ukraine. Civil society, people at the grassroots level, but also people fighting. So if we can even imagine a day when the fighting stops and we just stop there, we will leave people with serious traumas, with a need for trauma healing. So while helping people today, we also have to start working towards a future where we can see that traumas are healed and relationships are rebuilt, restored. And it's not just about Ukraine, it's about the region, Europe, and the world, because this conflict is not just about Ukraine. So in the long term, when we think about long term, we have to include Russian people and Russian civil society, because this is a society that is deeply troubled with lots of problems, society that has experienced violence on many different levels. This is not an excuse for no acting or not protesting against the war, but we have to take into account that if the war starts here in your mind, we have to also focus on people who are in this machine. So if we don't want to see another war in Europe again, we have to focus on helping Russian civil society, on restoring what was broken there, and the same with Belarus. So when people are saying the future of Europe, like how we want it look like, and what is the future, how to get there, many people are saying that the future of Europe depends on the outcome of the war in Ukraine. I will add one more thing. It's not just the outcome of the war, it's also our response to the conflict. So how we are responding to the conflict, how we are responding today, and what kind of a response we are planning in the long term. I think I'm good. I know that we will be talking about some concrete proposals in the second part of the session, so I will leave it here with, big issue and maybe more general introduction to our further talks. But I felt it was at least important for me to mention the big issue before we start talking about more concrete proposals. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Katarzyna, for such an excellent opening of the first session and for bringing our attention again that we are definitely moving away from a sustainable peace. And you also mentioned that our daily language has changed a lot. So instead of focusing on peace or something positive, we talk a lot about the war or even the number of the tanks. So everything that you have been talking about is also about the mind, that war, the same as peace, starts within our minds. So we should focus more on bringing the culture of the peace and working with the minds of the people, as that's a really important and crucial part of the peace building. So thank you so much. In the second part of the session, we'll have time to actually focus more on the practical solutions. If you do have questions for Katarzyna, because I see some raised hands, please put them in the chat box. We'll make sure to address them after we hear from all of the speakers in the first part of the session, and we'll come back to you with your question. So now I will move into our second speaker of the first session. It's Professor Dr. Richard Rubenstein, who was educated at Harvard College, Oxford University, and Harvard Law School. He was a practicing lawyer in Washington, D.C., and a political science professor at Roosevelt University in Chicago, and a law professor. In 1987, he started teaching at George Mason University, where he joined the faculty of the Institute for Conflict Analysis and Resolution and served as its director from 1988 till 1991. He retired from full-time teaching in 2023 and is now a university professor emeritus at the Institute's successor, the Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution. Professor Rubenstein is the author of 10 books on political violence and conflict resolution, including Alchemist of Revolution, Terrorism in the Modern World, When Jesus Became God, Aristotle, Children and Reasons to Kill, Why Americans Choose War. His latest work are Resolving Structural Conflicts, How Violent Systems Can Be Transformed, and Conflict Resolution After the Pandemic. Professor Rubenstein, please, the floor is yours. We would love to hear from you. And you're muted, if you can unmute yourself.
Yes, I was saying when I was muted, thank you very much for that introduction. And thank you very much, Kay, and everybody else for inviting me to participate in this important discussion. I'm participating here from the US. And being in the United States puts one in a very strange position to talk about a war taking place in Ukraine. Because the war taking place in Ukraine has so little effect on us here in the US. I suppose if you're trying to operate an empire and playing what the British used to call in their imperial days the great game of imperial politics, then the best situation you can be in is to be a sponsor of a war without being a party. To be arming one side in a conflict like the side that we're arming in Ukraine, and not to have to deal with any body bags coming home. I remember very well when I started in my, really as an anti-war person in the United States, it was in the Vietnam War. And I remember that for years in that war, even though US troops were fighting and dying, along with many more Vietnamese fighting and dying, the only time things really started to change in that war was when two things happened. The foreign correspondents, the American media, North American media correspondents who were in Saigon, finally decided to get out from behind the bar and go out into the field and see what was happening in the countryside. That was one big change. The other change was the media then coverage started to change, but this was years after the war started. And then the body bags started coming home. And at first there was a rule against even taking pictures of the coffins as they were unloaded from the planes at the air base in Dover. Finally, that rule was broken. And so the war started to hurt. And when the war started to hurt, people started to change their views about U.S. participation in that war. Well, that's what's not happening, or not very much at all, in the U.S. here. We're not suffering any casualties. All the casualties are Ukrainian and Russian. Now, according to U.S. sources, there are 500,000 such casualties, deaths, and injuries from that war. So a problem for us, and a problem for peacemakers and peace builders in a country which is also the world's largest and most aggressive empire, is how to make it clear to ourselves and how to make it clear to our own people that this is something for which we need to take responsibility and something which we need to change. So let me say my first impulse when talking about this, I have to admit, is kind of despairing, because there's an absolute deluge of news posing as propaganda, I should say propaganda posing as news, in journals like the New York Times and Washington Post. Ironically, the liberal journals, the leftish journals in the United States are the most bellicose when it comes to dealing with situations like the war in Ukraine. Also, ironically, the conservative party, the Republican Party in the United States, is the one which has so far expressed not great reservations about the war, but some reservations about the war. And so the kind of despairing feeling that one can get in what some would call the belly of the beast has to do with a media deluge, which continues to say things like the Russian invasion of Ukraine was unprovoked, and you can't talk about peace with aggressors if the result might be to reward aggression. Those two articles, I should say, almost of faith, that are repeated daily by the press here, that the invasion was unprovoked, and that any negotiations that might reward in any way aggression are illegitimate. Those two articles of faith continue to be repeated and certainly have some effect on public opinion. But at the point that one might despair about this, then there are signs of hope. And let me mention a couple of the signs of hope. First place, we know that the invasion, we believe that the invasion of Ukraine by Russia was wrongful, that it shouldn't have happened, that it was not only a mistake, but a crime. But we also know that it wasn't unprovoked. And little by little, knowledge is beginning to develop here. Understanding is beginning to develop here that, the world is not divided into good guys and bad guys, that things are more complex than that. And that, for example, the consistent refusal of the United States to deal with legitimate security concerns that Russia had, some of which involve Ukraine, was part of the buildup that led to the massing of Russian troops on the Ukrainian border, and then to the invasion. So the invasion was not unprovoked. Little by little, the knowledge seeps out that in 2014 there was the overthrow of an elected government in the Ukraine, a very unpopular government to be sure, but also an elected government in the Ukraine that the United States supported that overthrow, and that the Maidan revolt was in some ways a CIA operation. Which is, again, is not to say that that was entirely illegitimate either, but the United States was deeply implicated in it, and in the 8 years of bloody warfare in the Donbass region that followed. Warfare that should not have taken place if the Minsk II agreements had been followed and had been applied, but they never were. And that was fine with the United States that they never were. So one of the questions that we have is, and it's a question as peace educators, as peace advocates and educators, is how we help our people understand the complexities of situations like this, how we help them understand that the world is not divided into aggressors and defenders, but that there are nuances, there are grays, not just blacks and whites, that have to be understood if we're to move towards peace. And second, how can we help them understand that negotiating peace is not the same as rewarding aggression? If you talk about peace negotiations, of course, the Ukrainian regime's position is, the Zelensky position is that the negotiations we must not concede anything, including Crimea, including the status of Crimea. And then when I talk to my own country people here about issues like this, I discover that they don't know, that they don't know where Crimea is or what it is, but also that there is a kind of studied ignorance. And I say studied because, again, if one reads the media, one will almost never find any kind of reasonably complex discussion of what the Donbass is, who lives there, the differences between Russian-speaking groups and Ukrainian-speaking groups, and all the rest. That is simply not talked about. It's not covered. So then why do I talk about possible hopeful signs in this kind of bleak from the U.S. perspective, and of course, even bleaker from the Ukrainian perspective? Well, for one thing, we're starting to get polls in which people, U.S. people, ordinary U.S. people, are expressing fatigue and opposition even to the continuing support of the war by the U.S. This, at first, seemed to be mainly a function of the kind of the Trump wing of the Republican Party because of Trump's pro-Russian background and sympathies. But no, it's much more general than that. It's not only the Trump wing, it's a much more general phenomenon. People are starting to lose interest, really, and lose enthusiasm, and little by little lose this good guy, bad guy distinction analysis that has put them in the side of those who want to total victory for the Ukrainian regime. So that's happening. Also, one then discovers that as I shall say, the voices for peace in an empire like this one are very muted, of course, and there are not very many people initially who are voices of peace who are voicing them. Some of the people that I work with, for example, in the Washington, D.C. area, are organizations like Code Pink, which is a kind of famous woman-based peacemaking organization that does very effective and colorful educational efforts and demonstrations for peace. Now we find by reading the New York Times that there are attempts to smear them, to kind of do what Senator McCarthy used to do to people on the left in the United States. The New York Times runs several days ago a lengthy article pointing out that one of the co-founders of Code Pink's husband is a wealthy technological company guy who is pro-Chinese, who for years has been not working for the Chinese government, not at all, but offering views that are consistent with some of the views of the Chinese government. And so when I read this article, I thought, well, first of all, it's ridiculous. The man, the man is entitled to whatever his political views are. It has nothing to do with what his wife thinks and Code Pink thinks anyway. But then I realized this is a response to voices that are now being heard. The New York Times would not have run this kind of smear piece against Code Pink if Code Pink wasn't starting to have some influence. So this is an attempt, a McCarthyite attempt, to silence them and to discredit them, which I don't think would be taking place at all if they weren't starting to be heard. So this is a sign of hope. There are also, of course, some rumors of second-track diplomatic efforts that some people may be going on right now, especially with U.S. State Department officials visiting Russia, possibly to talk about what Putin might expect or accept in a peace negotiation. So all of that, of course, is under wraps, and all of that is these are only small signs and dim sides of hope in a situation that's generally bleak. And I want to say in conclusion that those of us in the peace movement here have not lost hope, that we are thinking hard about what needs to be done, and to follow the first speaker's ideas about what needs to be done to change people's minds and to lead us towards a culture of peace when we have a culture of war. But I want to emphasize here that what makes this so difficult is that we have an international system. The international system is not, as the realists sometimes say, the capital R realist, is not anarchy. The international system is imperial. And the reason that violence is growing on an international scale, in my view, is that competition between the empires is intensifying. The Ukrainian conflict can be looked at in some ways as a typical and traditional struggle between empires over disputed borderland territory. So the empire that we always hear talked about in the United States here, of course, is the Russian Empire, or the Russians who hope to restore an empire. But of course, there is no empire anywhere near the size and strength and propensity to violence of the U.S. empire and its European junior partner. So that, shall I say, united for the time being, U.S. European empire is one of the parties to the war. And so the questions that poses to us are, what does one do when you have a system that's generating conflict? When, as the first speaker said, conflict is in people's minds, but there's a relationship between what's in their minds and the system that they're operating under. this is an imperial system. What do we do about that? How do we get people in the United States to understand that life for them is actually going to be a lot easier and happier when they stop being an empire? How do we get people to understand that as horrible as the war in Ukraine is, and horribly destructive and dangerous in a nuclear context as well, what's even more dangerous is the coming war with China. That is, this is a dress rehearsal for in some ways, for a confrontation with China, which, when we talk about that at that point, and we talk about Republican Party or conservative opposition in the U.S. to the war in Ukraine, there's no opposition among conservatives to a war with China. In fact, the opposite. The right wing in the United States is violently anti-Chinese. So how do we prevent the Ukraine war from being the first step towards a world war that involves these empires in China? Well, it seems to me we have got to recognize the role that empires play in creating world war, and which means mobilizing anti-imperial sentiment, not just anti-war sentiment, but it also means imagining a non-imperial world. If we're not going to have a world dominated by empires, what should the system look like? I'm going to stop. I think that's the question that we need to answer, but I'm not going to try to answer it. I'm going to stop there, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Rubinstein, and thank you for bringing our attention again to the complexity of the world and how it is important to navigate the gray zone, and it's not an easy task. And also that usually when people experience the conflict firsthand, when they see the casualties, that's when their views actually change. And this personal trauma is something that Ukrainians experience every single day and go through every single day. I will pass the microphone to our next speaker, to Martina Pignati Morano, who is the Director of Cooperation Programs at the NGO Un Ponte Per, and with whom she has been collaborating since 2005 to support social movements in the Middle East. She has organized training sessions on human rights and active nonviolence in Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, Palestine, Syria, and Ukraine. She's the national contact person for the Civil Peace Interventions Table and is active in the Italian Network for Peace and Disarmament, where she organized campaigns to strengthen civil peace building and support disarmament policies. She represents Un Ponte Per at the European Peacebuilding Liaison Office and serves as an expert on civil society in the Monitoring Committee for the Experimentation of Civil Peace Corps and the Universal Civil Service. Currently, she is the president of the Ethical Committee and of Banca Popolare Etica. In the past, she has taught courses on peacebuilding and peacekeeping in the Peace Sciences program at the University of Pisa and co-directed the research journal. Martina, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Maria. Thanks to also the Ukrainian organizations that are participating with us in the project that is allowing us to have this conversation. We need many more of these peace projects. And as Maria was telling you, Un Ponte Per is a peace organization, although we are also engaged in humanitarian and development programs. And we were born in the Middle East, on the bridge between Italy and the Middle East. So forgive me if I will use many examples. I will make comparisons with what we've learned working in Iraq and Syria for more than 30 years and seeing how much civilians can advance in promoting human rights in conflict situations in these countries. Of course, we decided to engage in Ukraine and work with Ukrainians, with Russians, who have a strong hope and trust and determination and the possibility to transform also this conflict in a nonviolent way. And I just wanted to start by expressing all our solidarity to the Ukrainian, Russian, regional people who are with us in this call. And And I want to say that we cannot discuss peace without justice. So like Richard did, I just wanted to clarify that we all need to work to defend the right of self-determination of the Ukrainian people within their nation, and the integrity of the Ukrainian territories. At the same time, we need to defend the dignity of those in Ukraine that want to negotiate, that want to pilot other strategies to defend this conflict. And this, I think, is the primary task of international peace workers and peace builders, to listen to the local voices and make space for third ways, like Katarzyna was very, very effectively explaining in her first speech. So, in our experience, we've been working for decades in Palestine, in the northeast of Syria, and we have never been asked as peace organization to say that we supported armed struggle, that we supported the armed defense of those territories, but everyone truly believed we were defending and promoting our Palestinian friends, our friends from the northeast of Syria, to carry on their struggle for self-determination. And we believe one of the tasks of the peace-building community is to be in Ukraine with our values, defending our stance as peace organizations, and at the same time be fully trusted on the fact that we stand by our Ukrainian friends and partners in defending their right to self-determination. And so we have the need to make space for third options. In Iraq, that's the first thing we've been discussing with an Iraqi nonviolent movement that started spreading nationwide in 2005. They were saying, we were not with Saddam, but we are not with the United States, with the occupying forces. We are the third way, and we are civil society. We want our voices to be heard on what should be the future of Iraq. And now they're saying, many other voices in Iraq are saying, we're not with Iran and we're not with NATO. We have another view. And there are always those third voices that need to be heard, that need to be strengthened. And at times, these voices in the current conflict and in the war are those of conscientious objectors, for example. We have incredibly brave conscientious objectors in Russia, in Belarus, in Ukraine, that need to have this choice. They need to be given this choice without being jailed, threatened, assassinated for their stance in the conflict. We also have those who are choosing nonviolent resistance in different countries. We should, for example, make sure that European countries guarantee political asylum to those people. If conscientious objectors are asking for political asylum in Europe, especially if they are Russian conscientious objectors, they should be given political asylum. And this is something we should all fight for. So that's one option. Another one is to always try to focus as peace organization on the regional level. We are used to do it when we speak about restorative justice. We don't only have the offender and the offended, we have the community. And processes of restorative justice work only if you engage the community around them. So we cannot be focusing on Ukraine for peace building programs on Ukraine. We need to be focusing on the region. As my colleagues were saying before me, we need to engage with Russian civil society. We have a friend in this call that has been advancing many times very effective and smart ideas to change the perceptions of Russian people on the war, on the conflict, on the occupation. And these proposals are not receiving attention. I just go with practical ideas and proposals because time is short and I really want to listen to the other speakers. So I apologize if I don't really dive into any of these, but the third thing I wanted to say is that at the same time as peace workers, we need to meet the needs, the essential material and psychological needs of civilians who are suffering because of the occupation, because of the war. And at times, this may involve twisting a little bit the objectives of humanitarian calls. You know, if the international community in the end is putting lots of money on humanitarian programs, let's try to see if there is space there to work on, for example, psychological resilience of youth, of children, of activists in this situation. We've been doing it in many situations. For example, I remember Nonviolent Peace Force really managing to work in the camps of alleged Daesh fighters in Iraq through protection programs. You know, well, if that's where the money is, you know, let's try to see what we can do there. At the same time, let's show that we really, really care for the basic needs of people affected by conflict. And what should we do through our peace building programs instead? Katarzyna gave us a lot of very interesting insights. I just wanted to add maybe a provocation, because I feel that something we could do is to defend somehow what I believe are European values. They're probably not European. They are universal values that some of us may want to see strengthened around the world, but they have basically to do with the possibility of coexistence of different national identities in a territory without saying that one national identity is better than the other. So recognizing the dignity of all these identities and the richness of having them sharing a common space, and countering then extreme suprematist nationalisms everywhere. This is something that we believe is a priority in Europe, in many of our countries, and it is something we shall try to do in the nations affected by this war as well. Other idea, advocate with the European Union, for example, which is closer to us, to start making space for stabilization policies right now and programs right now, not after the war is over. Stabilization, as you know, the stabilization concept of the European Union allows countries, civil society organizations to start working now to prevent further escalation of the conflict. And this is something that in which we should engage policymakers, EU officials at all levels. We've been trying with the EPLO, European Peace Building Liaison Office, but much more effort needs to be put on this, in my view. What else? We need the peace studies community. We need the economists to study the situation. It's not difficult, and show in a very transparent way the costs of war, to make people and policymakers appreciate the possible gains from peace. They're always asking us, so why do you propose non-violent ways if peace building, obviously, in this situation wouldn't work? So, will violence work? Please prove it. We've seen the numbers. The World Bank was and other institutions, the NATO, and they were giving numbers. In the first year of war, the United States and Europe together spent about $100 billion on the war. So it was aid, military support, long-term loans, and in the same period, the overall damage to infrastructure buildings was worth $135 billion. The costs, comprehensive cost of reconstruction went up to 411 in 1 year. Doesn't make sense at all. We need the intellectual, the academic community to show it, so that people can appreciate what would be the gain from trying alternative ways. And finally, we need to act as a peace-building community. So I'd just like to close by saying that our organization, in partnership with Patrir and other Ukrainian organizations, some of them are in this call, launched a peace project, Peace Support Ukraine, with very, very limited funding, but in any case, important funding and financial support from the Soka Gakkai Institute in Italy. And with that program, we've been able to support peace education in Ukrainian schools. Peace education and peace building programs for youth leaders of Ukraine. Activities, courses, webinars on how to promote the psychological resilience of youth and children and people in Ukraine to the trauma of war. Supporting those who are so brave to advance in nonviolent resistance and non-cooperation with the occupation authorities in the occupied territories of Ukraine. All of this is doable. We need to show that we are doing our best as a peace-building community, and we need to tell each other what we are doing, because I assume many of you are doing things that are as interesting or even more effective than this one, but we're not really communicating to each other as much. So I hope I'm sure Kai will let you know also about our effort to create linkages and spaces to share experiences among peace-building organizations, so that we can show that we are not only able to organize peace conferences where we write a very interesting document asking our governments to do something. We are able to do something ourselves with the Ukrainian civil society, with the Russian civil society, with the Belarusian civil society. So that's the possibility we have. That's the duty we have also as Europeans today. I would close it here. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Martina, and for again highlighting the other way and defending the dignity of those who want to negotiate, and bring up from your experience also worldwide how it did work elsewhere from Iraq and Iran, and how it was really important to hear those other voices. And also that the focus should be on the regional level, and that humanitarian programs, they can be inclusive and they can incorporate a number of different elements, from protection to psychological support, covering the basic needs, but also highlighting and bringing attention to multiple identities that people have. Right now, I'm going to pass the microphone to my dear friend and the person that many of you here know. It's Kai Brand Jacobsen, who is widely regarded as one of the leading experts in peace building and dealing with complex crises in the world. For more than 25 years, he has worked across all continents and many of the most challenging war zones and crisis situations, from Iraq to Afghanistan, Sudan, Israel, Palestine, Cyprus, Northern Ireland, Sri Lanka, Nigeria, and elsewhere, at the invitation of the United Nations governments, international agencies, organizations, and also local communities affected by conflict and war. He's a senior trainer for the International Peace and Development Training Center and has provided more than 400 trainings and executive leadership programs in 48 countries. I can talk a lot about Kai, but I will provide the floor to you to share your experiences.
Thank you very much, Maria. And thank you to everyone who is joining us today. Thank you to everyone who is contributing here also as speakers and colleagues working in this field from around the world. When we first thought of organizing this webinar, the reason we wanted to do so is because, like many who have joined today, we recognize that we are at an inflection point. We're at a critical moment in our world. And the war in Ukraine brings this to a powerful front for many of us. But for those who are working in this field, we also recognize and know that it is not only this current and ongoing moment of the invasion and war in Ukraine, but it is part of a growing dynamic of war worldwide. And that's what we want to see how to address. And like Martina did as well, I want to express my deepest appreciation and solidarity for the people that are living in the midst of war and violence and under occupation now in Ukraine and in Western Sahara, for people in Yemen, for people who are living under the terrorism and terror of violence in Ecuador, where it's gone from 5 people killed per 100,000 in 2015 to 26 people killed per 100,000 this year. Violence is rising on many levels. One thing I just want to share, though, is that it is possible for us as a peace-building community to recognize the complexity of background and drivers and dynamics that create the conditions of conflict, while also saying clearly that war and invasion is wrong and is illegal. Saddam Hussein was a horrible and brutal dictator. I was demonstrating against his regime from the mid-1980s. That does not legitimize the United States invasion of Iraq and the terrible devastation and destruction which came after. There were backgrounds and dynamics and issues of conflict in Ukraine that needed to be addressed at many levels. That by no means legitimizes or makes acceptable in any way the barbaric and horrific invasion of Ukraine that took place, and the fact that both of those acts were war crimes and crimes against peace by the regimes which carried them out. But when we are living in a context over 30 years where we see the number of wars increasing, then those barriers, those frameworks of international law and our global system, which should restrain it, are increasingly weakened. And that is where we find ourselves today. And then the question before us is, how do we, as people with agency and power, part of organizations or students or experts and researchers around the world, what do we do in this moment? And also just to share, because Richard, you know, I have such deep respect and admiration for your work over so many decades. I just want to share that while in the context of Maidan and the Rising, or Georgia before, or Serbia and Otpor, you did have international NGOs and foreign organizations with training, including ones that were funded by regimes abroad. Do not rob the people of agency. Those who stood in Maidan did so like those who stood in the Me Too movement, like those who stand in Black Lives Matter, like those who stand against resistance and oppression in many parts of the world, in a context of a society with many different parts of its population, not all supporting that movement, but knowing so many of those who were there and having been in touch with them at those moments. For many, it was an incredible rising for dignity. And for the individual citizens involved, that's what it was. So to share just a bit, some things to put in context around the war in Ukraine, but also more broadly. And as Katarzyna asked, please do let me know if you see this now. So the first thing I want to do, I'm not going to spend time on diagnosis. A leading practitioner in the field over decades once said, yes, we do diagnosis, but we also need to focus on therapy and what can be done. And as Maria introduced, we've done many webinars and sessions to try and help people make sense and understand the different dimensions. Now we want to focus primarily on proposals. So I'm just going to spend a few brief moments on this. But one,
sorry to interrupt you. We cannot see the full screen. We see only a piece of it. Can you expand it?
Interesting. So let's see. Aha. I think I may know why. And I'm going to try and start it again, hopefully without delaying too much, because there's so many brilliant people we want to hear from today and to have discussion together. Does it come through now, Maria?
Yes.
All right. Thank you all. So a first reality we need to deal with is that war and violence is rising dramatically globally. We've had a more than doubling of the number of wars in the world over the past decade. So for many of us who were working in this field in the 90s and the 2000s, part of the mantra we were all hearing was how armed violence was reducing, armed conflict was reducing. A reality is that the number of active wars has doubled in 10 years, but was increasing significantly before that. Another aspect is the number of countries that are involved in 2 or more armed conflicts at the same time has been increasing continuously and has actually been high for the last 40 years. The average ongoing conflict in the mid-1980s had been happening for about 13 years. Today, the average ongoing war has been continuing for 20 years. So while there are wars like that in Ukraine, which have broken out more recently, we're seeing the making permanent the status and conditions, the lived experience of war and instability in many parts of our world. And I want to share this quote from Pope Francis from before the war in Ukraine began, when he said that while the last century knew the devastation of 2 deadly world wars, the threat of nuclear war, and a great number of other conflicts, Today, sadly, we find ourselves engaged in a horrifying world war fought piecemeal. And the number of people that are being affected by organized systematic destruction of the climate, by our political choices and our economic system, and by the displacement from war is increasing dramatically. The number of refugees, for example, went up from 40 million 10 years ago to over 111 million this year. So we're seeing the lived experience of fragility and instability, and over nearly 350 million people in severe humanitarian need right now. Some of the other dynamics in this context, the dramatic escalation and normalization of military budgets, military expenditure, militarism, and military expansion. For many of our countries, our military budgets are growing. Australia just set a plan to spend more than 1.2 billion on long-range weaponry. You had the recent meeting at Camp David. You have what's been happening in Europe and the South China Sea. You have the escalating tensions and confrontations in Asia, leading to military increases across the region, but also in countries like Mali, Niger, Nigeria, dramatic increases in military expenditure under the context of the terrorist threat. Meanwhile, more people are being killed in these countries by their police and armed forces than by the terrorist groups they're meant to be addressing. So while we often focus on Europe or Asia, you have had the creation of a context of wars of terrorism stretching across much of the Sahel, which is affecting the daily lives of hundreds of millions of people. Continual expansion of military bases over the last 30 years, an astonishing and extreme normalization and rise in the role of mercenary corporations. And another thing we need to be dramatically and clearly aware of is the militarization of policing. You're having mercenary companies like Academy, formerly Blackwater. It's the largest trainer of police in the world today. But you're also having transformations of doctrine, of equipment, and the use of military-grade force against civilians in many parts of the world. This all links with the normalization of war. Citizens globally are getting used to seeing nonstop, endless wars, from the invasions of Iraq, the ongoing continual war, which is happening even after foreign forces withdraw in Afghanistan, the wars in Syria, Yemen, Nigeria, Ukraine, and elsewhere. So people see it more and more, and it just appears normal. Hundreds of millions of children and youth are in online wargaming every single day. And when you look at the connections between what they're seeing in the news, in movies, on games, again, it's just the saturation of our space with war, but also the saturation of academic and public spaces. When you look at response to the ongoing invasion and occupation and war in Ukraine, when you listen to the news, when you listen to public discourse, you constantly hear a military extremist discourse under the framing of security and security studies in universities. There's very little that looks at how do we deal with the incredible difficult and complexity of the situation from effective approaches. The other challenge is that whereas in the 90s and the 2000s, lots of politicians were increasingly aware of peace-building programming, and you had the examples from South Africa to the agreement in Oslo and many others at that time, or the Northern Ireland Accords. Now, when you meet with people in government in many parts of the world, they are not exposed to a breadth of practical measures and options of what they can do to address conflict effectively. We, as a peace-building community, have failed there. While we have professionalized peace-building, and we have lots of NGOs doing it, and governments providing grants, that's a narrow stream. But we have not impacted countries' actual approaches to how they're addressing critical peace and security issues. One publication I just want to recommend for all, Sir General Rupert Smith, The Utility of Force, longest serving military commander of British forces in Northern Ireland, deputy commander of the First Gulf War and invasion of Iraq. And here he recognizes the failure, the bankruptcy, the incompetency of war. War is unable to achieve the goals that are set for it or to address the drivers of conflict. We could spend a lot more going into that, but it is vital. All these slides will be made available also afterwards. So, engagement for effective solutions. What can we do? Currently, there is virtually no significant, clear organizing on the part of society, government, political leadership at national, European, or international levels for peace and effective solutions to the ongoing war in Ukraine. and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. This isn't unusual. A reality is in the midst of these contexts, when it's deeply polarized conflicts, we need to work to build the momentum, build the constituencies, the engagement, and the leadership for what Martina said and what people on the ground in any country that is occupied or in war, from Palestine to Sahara to Iraq before, just peace. So, for example, when we're saying to colleagues and the people in Ukraine and talking about negotiations, they may be willing to have that conversation if we are first listening and looking under what legitimate conditions. So, for example, having worked for over 27 years in the peace building field and in peace talks, I would support negotiations in the context of withdrawal of invading forces, the same as Iraq wanted as well, and a change in government in Russia, which is legitimate. The same way that Tony Blair, George Bush, Putin, and others should be held accountable under international law for the war crimes and crimes of war they are waging on our populations, and in this moment, on the people of Ukraine. In terms of tasks for peace building, to understand the criticality and urgency of this moment. We are not on the brink of war and crisis. We are in the midst of war and crisis. We need to act. The second is to multiply these spaces. Increase spaces to discuss and create spaces for dialogue, interaction, addressing difficult issues, but also, again, go beyond analysis, go beyond prescription, and sit and work through and think through what practically can we do? What policy recommendations will we bring to government? How will we engage in conversations at university, in the media, to not only critique the absence of voices for peace, but to be the voices for peace and to bring forward what can be done. Go beyond talking. Talking in meetings aren't enough. We need to go forward to concrete planning, organizing, action, and effective and organized engagement. We have Andrei Kamenchikov here and the work they're doing to support resistance and opposition to the war in Russia. We have John Ruhr and the team that's trying to deploy around the nuclear station in Ukraine. And there are so many extraordinary people from those inside Ukraine working on trauma healing, on social inclusion, on social recovery from the war, to opposition activists from across Russia. But again, it isn't just about Ukraine, Russia, Belarus. It's about the dynamic of war more broadly. And we need to also develop really practical measures to address the war and to do advocacy for them and to create programming to support it. Some of that, support peace-building organizations in Ukraine. There is a breadth of extraordinary work being done by organizations in Ukraine. I would also say really build a front of supporting resistance activists in Belarus and grow the support to the opposition to the war in Russia. Address concrete conflict issues and the impact of the war. This is looking globally at the vital need for peace education, working with trauma. And in the context of Ukraine, currently the Ukrainian government, the World Bank, European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, they're having vital conversations focusing on physical recovery. But we also need to look at the deep needs of social recovery and the impact of an entire population living through war. And there are amazing organizations in Ukraine at the forefront of doing this work. They don't need patronizing. They don't need talking down to from organizations from outside. They need alliances and support. Also, to establish a civilian EU-Ukraine peace support office in Ukraine so that we learn the lessons of the last 20 plus years internationally. And instead of beautiful Western NGOs always writing in papers, we should collaborate, we should partner, actually doing it. Focusing on supporting national ownership, national capacities, and collaborating in our efforts to address the breadth of needs that the war has imposed. Organize local, national, EU fora for peace, and globally. Here I'm orienting to the war in Ukraine, but also globally. And we need to hit the pavement, get onto the ground, speak with people, do one-on-one meetings with journalists, with politicians, more active advocacy to bring forward practical measures and what can be done. I've spoken too long and I apologize, just some things globally. We can never emphasize enough the vital need to introduce peace education into all levels of education, from schooling through to university. People are not understanding, learning, or being trained in how to deal with conflicts effectively. To that end, we need to build and invest in real capacities and infrastructure for peace. While our military budgets in real terms today dramatically exceed the height of the Cold War, we are not actually investing in proven and effective means of dealing with conflicts effectively. learning the lessons of how to establish early warning and prevention systems, investing in training in civil peace services and deploying them locally, nationally, and internationally, creating local departments and ministries of peace from local to national levels. And instead of only saying we need alternatives to war, actually training and building the competencies for them. I would also mention that there's very few master's programs in the world that actually train people in the core competencies for doing peace building. Most focus on reading, research, writing, but very little on applied capabilities and skills. We need to reach people. Learn the lessons from the global climate movement, the civil rights movement, the women's and gender rights movements, the Me Too movement, the Time's Up movement. We need to much more actively engage with citizens and governments worldwide to make peace be seen as practical. And I'm going to stop there, but just to say, again, as Martin Luther King said before, those who love peace must learn to organize as effectively as those who love war. And I would say even more so. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kai, for your presentation and again for highlighting how important it is to hear from Ukrainian voices on the ground already doing the work, already being actively engaged in the peace building activities, but also drawing our attention that it's important and crucial for peace building across the world to actually have engagement and have partnership for peace, listening to each other and having a collaboration instead of trying to win something or fight over something, because peace is where we concentrate together and we work and fight for peace together. I know that we are running over the time right now, and I know that we have a number of other speakers for session number 2, especially speakers joining from Japan and for whom it's quite late right now. So what I would offer right now is, if you do have a question directly targeted to any of the speakers, just please use the chat box, and if speakers are available, if they don't have to leave due to other engagement, they will try to answer it. Otherwise, we'll try to save up some time at the end of the second session to engage all of the speakers in communication and conversation together, just because I'm quite aware that it's late. So with that, we're going to move to a second session, a second part of our webinar, which is called The War in Ukraine, a Peace Building Response and Future Peace and Security Architecture in Europe. And I want to introduce our first speaker, and I'm terribly sorry if I pronounce your name wrong. I'll try my best. Yoshioka Tetsuya, who has founded the Peace Boat and started to organize. Did I say it right?
Yes, yes, no problem. Yeah, Yoshioka. Yeah.
Sure. I'm so sorry if I did say it wrong, but I want to introduce Mr. Yoshioka, who started organizing voyages for education and people-to-people reconciliation between Japan and other Asian countries, and to study Japanese war responsibility. From this vision of promoting people's diplomacy, Peace Boat grew into an organization that organized more than 90 trips for peace and sustainability. Over the last 30 years, besides being a leading advocate with Japanese civil society, he has engaged internationally with Peace Boat on projects including peace education for Israeli and Palestinian youth, Eritrea, Ethiopia people peace talks, and Northeast Asian people dialogues. Yoshioka has authored books on the civil war in the former Yugoslavia, the Russia-Japan Northern Territories dispute, and on Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution as a global common value for peace. He is a commentator in the Japanese media on issues including the Iraq War and the Korean-Japan relations, and has been invited to address the United Nations on issues including peace education and disarmament. Also, Mr. Yoshioka is a founding member of the GPAC International Steering Group and has nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize in 2009 for leading the global Article 9 campaign to abolish war, to protect and promote Japan's war-renouncing constitution. Mr. Yoshioka, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Maria, right? That's your name.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, Maria.
Thank you, Maria. Yeah, so I think that is quite a late night in Tokyo, but I'm full of the energy because your speeches is really inspire me, and especially Kai. Thank you very much that you gave me quite a lot of energy to start to speak. So, and first of all, I think that the biggest frustration is really when I think about that, the Ukrainian war, when we think about that, why we cannot prevent this war as a peace builder or as a member of the conflict prevention society. And I think there is a lot of the elements already. They're very clear that this crisis will come in. And because especially in Europe, That is we had experience of the former Yugoslavian war. And that is a process is when war happened that many people they mentioned about that already 10 years ago of the starting the actual the war. There is a going to the crisis in early 80s. So and but very unfortunately, let's say even the European society or international society couldn't learn from that former Yugoslavian war. Even thousands of people is they suffered. The hundred thousands of the people that suffered by the former Yugoslavian war, and everybody remember about that Sarajevo, the tragedy in the Sarajevo, and so on. But we didn't learn much. That is a quite a big frustration for me, including me, of course, huh? Because that already that from the early 2000 and even that situation of the Georgia, and also that 2014 already the war started. So and the Ukrainian war happened in 2022 is let's say it is a surprise, but if our point of view, there is quite a lot of the possibility there. And but we cannot prevent this war. I think now again we have to really start to think about that. Why? And how for future, how we can prevent the war is a still very serious issue, I think. But the situation in the world is the other way around. I'm really worried about that sometimes some discussion about the crisis of the invasion by China to the Taiwan. I think that is I'm from the Northeast Asia. Completely that the Taiwan-China situation and the Russia-Ukrainian situation different. But there's sometimes that this Ukrainian war is a kind of the provoking about that the promote about the fear in Northeast Asia also that the Chinese invasion to the Taiwan and so on. So and that is utilized by the right-wing people and each country of the Northeast Asia, and also who would like to promote the militarization. For example, in Japan, now everybody talking about that, how to increase military expenditure. And before, 5 years ago, or 3 years ago, even before the Ukrainian war, still that is a big discussion about we should increase that the expenditure or not, military budget or not. But now, no discussion. Immediately, government start to say that to increase the military expenditure. So no opposition anymore. And not only that, that's a military weapon, the business is growing completely rapidly. And before Ukrainian war, we had a big discussion, the academic society, I mean the university and so on, can cooperate with the military, the weapon development. And basically very negative because of the experience of the World War II. But now, nobody talk about that. Immediately that is, yeah, we have to protect the violence or invasion like a Russian, and Russia is a neighborhood for us. So Ukrainian war is ongoing. But I would like to emphasize in the Northeast Asia, this war is a provoking of the new war in the Northeast Asia. And it is a very dangerous area also. It is not necessary to explain about the North Korea and the Korean war is not finished yet. Yeah, 75 years. That's still the armistice. But this I think now I'm not talking about only that Northeast Asia issue, because Northeast Asian issue now is really linked with this Ukrainian war and make world very dangerous. And also, this is a quite deeply related with the nuclear weapon crisis. We are working also that the Hiroshima and Nagasaki issue, and with ICANN, as a member of the ICANN, that we are very worked hard about the abolition of the nuclear weapon. I think that all of you, the against the nuclear weapon, I think. But now completely the discussion is let's say half people in Japan is start to say that, oh, okay, we had a Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but not to repeat again that we have to have the nuclear weapon. That kind of opinion is starting, because like our neighborhood, Russia, the nuclear armed, and we have to protect from them. And I think nowadays that is this nuclear weapon issue, we have to really strongly, as an international society, especially with the peace builders, cooperate each other and against the nuclear weapon, and really try to push of the abolition of the nuclear weapon. And we have to support that the nuclear ban treaty, because there is also strong logic that now that there is a real crisis of the nuclear war. Actually, Russia is President Putin is threatened about the nuclear war. So it is the most realistic time now. So that's why we have to abolish the nuclear weapon, right? Of course, some people is saying that the nuclear deterrent, but on the other hand, to insist to abolish the nuclear weapon is also very strong message, because without a nuclear weapon, we are not to suffer by nuclear weapon. Very simple logic. So I think nowadays that we are thinking, we have to support the Ukrainian people. We are humanitarian support we're doing. Of course, that we have to support them. But at the same time, we have to really think about that other conflict zone or potential conflict zone, and we have to really prevent the war. And we don't have time to, how to say, disappoint or just only the crime. Otherwise, I'm really seriously feeling that war, terrible war, will happen in other region more. So I think that is that's why most important point for me is that, again, we have to really start to build strong solidarity network and a movement for the peace and peace building. And this is a same situation we are facing. And of course, and the people in Ukraine who are loving the peace, we have to be together, and we have to save our world and our planet for ourselves and for our family and for our children and for our grandchildren. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ashoka, for bringing us to the other side of the world, and again reminding that the conflicts are brewing not only in Europe, but we still have a very big element and impact of North-South Korea, and again the issue of the nuclear weapons use, and that slogan "not to repeat again," which was heavily distributed after the Second World War, we see happening all over again back in Ukraine. So again, mentioning and reminding us about the strong solidarity network for peace and peace building. It's my main takeaway from your presentation. Again, I'm sorry that we had to keep it quite short with a Q&A and move it to the second part of the session. We are quite aware that some of the speakers have other engagement, and for some of the speakers it's quite late. Therefore, those who are able to stay after after the end of all presentations, we'll open the floor for the discussions. If not, there is also a possibility to organize a separate event where we would focus not so much on hearing the presentation, but actually actively engaging in the discussions. With that, I want to introduce our next speaker. It's Sarah Elizabeth Dill, who provides legal representation, strategic consulting for individuals, corporations, governments, and non-government associations. Her area of focus include international law, human rights, foreign affairs, sanctions, war crimes, cross-border finance, national security, and anti-corruption. Sarah served as the International Bar Association Middle East and North Africa Region Liaison Officer for war crimes and international criminal law. She's now serving as a treasurer of the War Crimes Committee and is a certified financial crimes specialist and certified global sanctions specialist. Presently, Sarah is serving as one of the experts advising Ukrainian lawyers and judges as to war crimes prosecutions and trial monitoring. Thank you, Sarah. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Maria, and thank you to everyone. It has been so incredible to hear all of the interventions. I was actually thinking as I listened that I wish we had one of those artists that drew out and kept the words of everything that discussed, because as I kept hearing so many themes and things that hadn't been discussed for years, it was really inspiring to hear that so many of us are thinking from that. And so being mindful of the time, I also noted that, and I really appreciate that as we've gone from focusing on Ukraine to looking more globally, that this is really a somber anniversary to hold this conference, as many of us still feel the pain of the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan, the utter failure of negotiations that occurred, the failure to have the Afghan people at the table, the abandonment of them, and the tragedy that's unfolded since then. And with that in mind, as well as with what's happening in Yemen, what's happening in Syria, that's going to kind of guide some of my remarks today. And as I took a step back and thinking about the questions that were posed to all of us today, the world has become such a volatile place at so many levels in our daily lives, in our broader lives, in the global conflicts that we see. And as some of you touched on in the education and the discussions of the war language versus peace language, and I think that that truly is a vital part of this, is that there is a ground level approach that we need to take from day one with our children, with our young populations. But I also think that we fail time and again to learn from the mistakes of the past, or to modify our behavior and engage in proactive problem prevention. We are a reactive society. We ignore the age-old adage of an ounce of prevention is greater than a pound of cure, and fail to have things in place. I think even the pandemic showed us this, that we simply don't have the systems there. But most of all, I think the world continues to suffer from colonialism still, and xenophobia. And some of the speakers have touched on this. And I appreciate that, because as most of you know, when you work in these populations, I think it was Kai who said, we should not talk down to these populations. But unfortunately, I think the remnants of colonialism still exist. And we've simply dressed it up in courtroom robes and diplomacy. But there's still such a narrow point of view and strategy development that results in the failures to not prevent armed conflict, but also to allow the atrocities in war to drag on for decades without solutions. So today I'm going to address 5 areas where I have some suggestions and ideas for reforms or changes, and drawing on experiences working in various countries, but also really pleased to hear a lot of the things today already. In a way, I'm a bit blessed to have to come towards the end. So the first one is really looking at early warning and innovative diplomacy. We have centuries of experience about what happens in a society, in government, in business, in the lead up to an armed conflict or civil unrest. And while certainly every situation is different, there are always clues or indicators as to what is yet to come. We can look at financial flows, population flows, rhetoric in the news or nowadays on social media, something we saw with the Rohingya. But we must no longer ignore the warning signs or dismiss them or discount them. The international community must pay greater attention to situations even before there's a spark that can ignite into a fire. We must start to engage at the gathering of kindling or purchasing of matches. I'll never forget when I was working on war crimes cases out of Bosnia and Serbia, and reading the documents coming from the government in the lead up to Srebrenica. And you could see as they were the requisition orders, everything that we're doing, and knowing what we know now, I thought, how did no one see this? How did no one look at what was happening and say they are planning something truly atrocious to occur? But then at the signs of emerging conflict or unrest, we must also modify the way the world engages in international diplomacy and intervention. The us versus them or evil enemy rhetoric can only fan the flames and make negotiation or mediation impossible. Terrorist or other designations and sanctions can create barriers to peace building and further distance the relevant parties, whilst also causing great humanitarian crisis, as we see in Yemen, in Afghanistan, in Syria following the earthquake, and the difficulty that organizations had to get aid in. The absence of delisting or rehabilitating a, quote, enemy group poses a great risk to seeking peace, both in the adoption by the population of the peace talks, going from the we do not negotiate with terrorists to we need to make peace with them and incorporate them in their government. That's a huge difficulty for governments. And so from the sanction standpoint, that's definitely something that we need to look at more. Colombia was a good positive example. But then if you look at Afghanistan and the hurdles we faced in the last months of negotiations, and even the inability now to engage due to existing sanctions, whereas if we look at Yemen, where the broad sanctions and designations against the Houthis were rolled back, leaving in place the specific individualized sanctions for gross human rights abuses, and the movement we've seen in peace talks, negotiations, opening up humanitarian aid corridors, even what's happening with the removal of oil from the tanker in the Gulf. But finally, the world also needs more neutral countries to truly serve as peace negotiators. Yes, alliances are important for economic and military reasons, but even in recent decades, superpowers like the US have placed increasing pressure on allies who have relations with their purported enemies. This polarization and exclusivity has resulted in a void where few nations remain who can serve as natural arbiters or even a neutral ground or location where the talks can occur. If we truly want to prevent unrest or conflict from growing into a full-scale war, we must have the tools and actors to engage early on and take steps to walk the parties back from the brink of war and develop solutions for peace. Taking lessons from the business community and long-established principles of negotiation and problem-solving are also important, but something that's often missing in the NGO capacity. And some of this is simply that you don't have people going from business to NGOs very often, yet there are some really great principles and practices that certainly could be applied in these contexts. And it's especially more vital to do so because, as so many have said, these contexts, there's so much more at stake. You have human lives, you have survival. The next aspect is diversity and inclusion, something that we hear day to day. All companies and organizations have questionably effective diversity and inclusion trainings, but we need to work more diligently to have greater diversity in our legal, our diplomatic, our policy sectors on a number of levels. And I don't just mean racial or ethnic diversity or gender identity, but also in the backgrounds of education, work experience, civilian versus military, historical context, ways of thinking. For example, considering legal perspectives other than the traditional Western Eurocentric viewpoint, such as Sharia law systems, and understanding that if we're working in regions, we need to focus on what legal system, what background that system has, and learn from their approaches, not always assuming, as I usually say, the quote, West is best. Echoing what's been said, that we need to know from the people in the country or region in need of help as to what solutions will work for them, what they will find legitimacy and have lasting peace, listening to them as to what their goals and desires are for peace, what they truly see as being necessary for moving forward. And a lot of that really requires greater diversity, which falls on all of us to ensure that when we are brought into a meeting or brought to speak at a conference, that we look at who the other speakers are and raise our voices to say, you know what, I appreciate this invite, but this person brings a perspective that I think is missing or important. Next, and this may be a part where I become probably more of a hawk than others who are here, but we really need to engage human rights and military sectors more regularly. The military is not going to go away, unfortunately, and both sides need to have a greater understanding of the other and how they operate, the laws and policies that govern their experiences, but also developing solutions or strategies. These sectors should not operate in separate silos, criticizing the other, but rather work in tandem, educating, training, engaging, and finding solutions and operations manuals. Far too often, I see criticism from one side or the other, but from people who've never stood in the other's shoes or learned about what their day-to-day is like. I found, however, that when conducting trainings with PMCs or engaging in strategy sessions with active duty military personnel, there is more common ground, and there is an emerging desire to consider human rights, to consider international humanitarian law. And I think the more that we can engage in that, to build those bridges and have people at the table, the more important it is. Every conference or working group on war crimes or peace building or security efforts needs to include voices from all sectors. And in doing so, we can hopefully have a positive influence on those sectors, ensure that what they are doing when they're on the ground is more compliant with human rights and international law, but also that we can develop strategies again for that early intervention, for that early prevention. Second to last, as echoed here today, and it really makes me so happy to see so many speakers focusing on this, because it was missing from the dialogue for so long, is the mental health and reconciliation aspect. This has to be present at all stages. As so many have noted, the trauma from armed conflict or civil unrest is lasting, requires long-term treatment and engagement, but it needs to be at all steps of the process, from the first encounter through documentation, investigation, through the prosecutions and the aftermaths. Far too often I hear from survivors and victims who say that they didn't even get the access to trauma, maybe at their first initial encounter, but then they were going through the process of having to testify at a trial, and there was no trauma treatment. There was no mental health treatment for what they were going to have to endure, reliving that. But it's also something that we need to have trainings, as so many of you have said, interaction with the press. We've seen in recent years the problem of re-traumatization, where a victim is interviewed countless times and forced to revisit the trauma they endured time and again. But that also poses a problem for documentation, issues of inconsistent statements. And so we really need to have this cross-sector training and acknowledgement of the trauma that occurs in war. Again, reaching back to diversity in some of these interwoven threads, ensuring that even the trauma treatment has gender and ethnic or religious sensitive perspectives, that those going in to do the training have the background and knowledge. For one of the things that we saw with a lot of the Syrian refugees was that the number of women who'd experienced sexual violence in conflict, and they would have a well-intentioned, well-trained, lots of empathy male practitioner going to interview the woman. And that's just simply not something that could occur in those contexts. Finally, in this regard, we definitely need more focus on the reintegration of returning fighters. These are people, oftentimes when you're dealing with young soldiers, child soldiers, young men who at the age of 17 or 18 were picking up a gun and going to war. They're now coming back, and that's the only life they've known. They didn't have the ability to develop skills, to get an education, to start a career. And so when they're coming back, not only do we have to ensure that they have the medical treatment, the mental health treatment, and all of the other things, but we need to reintegrate them into society. It's something we're seeing efforts on even with individuals who are formerly involved in Al-Qaeda and Daesh and other organizations. How do we return them to society? But not just how do we give them the skills to go back into society, to open companies, whatever it is, but we also need efforts with the community to accept those people back into society, to not ostracize them, to welcome them into their community. And so all of that becomes a part of reconciliation and needs to be a part of all of the programs that we are implementing through this process. The last thing that I'm going to speak on to close up my time here is, and I call it accountability that matters. And accountability in the last few decades has been a very top-down approach, led by the important formation of the International Criminal Court and other specialized tribunals, focusing on the highest level and most serious offenders. And yes, prosecuting or convicting a president or a general is important symbolically, but does that really foster accountability and lasting peace at the individual ground level? And we need this accountability. Take, for example, Yemen, with its rich history of tribal and local conflict resolution in courts, something that's understood and trusted by the people. But notably, ICC investigations have been pending in Afghanistan and Palestine for years, with little forward movement or international support. At times, even international opposition as major powers fear having their own citizens brought before the tribunal. The people long for investigations, documentation, accountability, even
I think we have lost Sarah just for a moment. Sarah, I don't know if
creating a history of what occurred, but have had little results. Syria hasn't. Am I still there?
You're backing now. There was a pause for a moment. Now we're hearing you clearly again.
Okay, good. And I'm just wrapping up. But on the other hand, as we have, Syria and Afghanistan and Palestine waiting for progress on accountability, the conflict in Ukraine had an immediate and robust response with domestic prosecutions in Ukraine, but also strong investigations and intense deployment of resources at the international level, even arrest warrants for Putin. And I do not sit here today and say that the ICC does not matter, but we need to put more resources into local accountability measures as part of this process, listening to what the people want accountability to look like, and focusing that this is truly the foundation of the ICC's complementarity principle. But these have to be locally driven. It has to be a local perspective. And as others have said, we need to support what they want to do. We need to help them with the resources and listen to them and say, how can we help you? This is what you should do. We need to ensure that what accountability looks like is the goal of the affected population, not what the world wants to see. We need more investment engagement on reconciliation, on restorative justice, and focusing on getting populations to live peacefully with one another, something that also draws on mental health, but something that we see in so many, in Armenia and Azerbaijan, in so many lasting conflicts where this tension and anger lives from generation to generation. And that's what we need to put a halt to. I'll conclude by saying that we need innovative solutions and flexibility in our thinking, and conferences like this and further discussions are truly the way to do that. The willingness to accept that old ways of doing things are not always right, and the ability to try something new, to bring new voices to the table, such as we're doing here, and to engage in more cross-sector conversations and strategy development. This falls on all of us to ensure that we're not engaging in repetitive failure, but rather in new growth that truly fosters lasting change. To not become so focused on one conflict that we allow millions to starve or die in others. We will never eliminate all wars or evil, but we can mitigate its devastating impact on the innocent civilian populations. As I've repeatedly said, the goal of every human rights lawyer is to be out of work and need to change careers. I truly thank everyone who is working tirelessly on fostering peace and all of you here today. And I hope that we can continue to put forward conversations such as this one and put these wonderful ideas into practice and policy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, dear Sarah, for your excellent presentation and actually for bringing the practical recommendations of what could be really done, from early warning and innovative diplomacy, which really allows us to have a more deeper look on what is happening right now in Nigeria, in Sudan, and many other countries, but also who can be a peace negotiator and how we can really listen to the voices on the ground and provide accountability to what people see as accountability and give the people a local ownership of the process itself. So thank you so much for the presentation. I will pass the microphone right now to my dear friend and colleague, Laura Pistarini, who is a program manager and a peacebuilding advisor of Peace Support Ukraine at Patria. Since the outbreak of the invasion and war in Ukraine, she has been involved in coordination and support of international partnerships and humanitarian aid to Ukraine and humanitarian development peace nexus. Laura works across international security, human rights protection, and mass atrocities prevention to the current challenges of contemporary democracies. The floor is yours, Laura.
Thank you, Maria. Again, I'm very honored to have been invited to this conference today. After amazing speakers, as a young practitioner, this is truly an honor. I think that I have been very blessed with an amazing framing that has been given already. And a lot of the things that I plan to speak on today were already mentioned. So I will make an effort not to repeat anything that was already said. So there are several trends right now contributing to instability and conflict, going from the terrible migration management that we have been seeing not only in Europe but worldwide, the increase in asymmetric and hybrid warfare, civil wars, the increase of AI, military and surveillance technology, also connected to disinformation and attacks to democracy, crisis of multilateralism, polarization and lack of social cohesion, climate change, human rights violations. And again, as said, and for me, that's something that's very close to my heart, colonial, imperialistic, and exploratory mindsets that are still very much permeating international systems today. As Martina said, and I very much agree, peace cannot not be possible without justice. So at the basis of all these trends, I see over and over again the inherent inconsistencies of our current economic system that have to be taken into consideration when analyzing these trends and dynamics. I'll jump right into the recommendations towards positive peace. The first one, and that I think that has not been talked about enough, is to actually put in place effective arms control mechanisms and increase international cooperation in this area. The fueling of military support and arms race in certain areas of the world won't stay there. The support for arms in Ukraine will not stay in Ukraine. They will go into other areas, into other regions through arms trafficking, and they create full instability in other regions. So this is incredibly important. As mentioned before as well, gun violence is one of the major issues around the world in terms of violence. In all throughout the world, 44% of homicides are a cause of gun violence and gang violence. This is a statistic of Amnesty International. And I think that we should put a lot of focus on that. The second one is something that we have seen throughout Ukraine and also in other contexts, is the need to support veterans and increase national, regional, and local governments' capabilities for civilian transition. The first step that I have put here in my notes is something that will permeate this presentation actually, and it's listen. Listen to what civil society and communities are already doing to support demobilized combatants. They only need support. The things that we have learned from the Afghanistan war, from other contexts, will not necessarily work in Ukraine. And the communities on the ground have the knowledge to do the tweaks and to apply it to the regional context. Focus on supporting programs also need to be thought into fostering sustainability of these services to the public authorities, because especially from the issues of veterans, this is a service that will need to be given through generations. It's going to be a long-term support. So I think that we should not forget that. There are amazing organizations on the ground already working on this and that need support. The third one is one that I feel that I repeat over and over again, which is focus on the youth, peace, and security agenda. So supporting programs and civil society organizations focusing on youth empowerment, engagement, and participation. Hire young people and invest in their potential. This seems very simple, but it's the practice. It's the theory, therefore the practice. So please, as members of civil society, focus on increasing the capabilities of young people and investing on them. Ask young people what they want and what's important for them. Support advocacy campaigns led by youth, and tailor peace processes so that they can include youth engagement and participation. But connected to that, actually, we need to focus on training youth leaders and groups to be able to speak to authorities and take part in such processes. These capabilities need to be developed in order for these programs to work effectively. Support youth exchange programs to foster solidarity and understanding. And donors should also take youth work seriously. Youth work is not voluntary work. Youth organizations need funding. This is one of the first things that I hear every time that I interview young people on the ground in Ukraine. I would also like to give a quick recommendation. I listened to a very good podcast this weekend, and I have been thinking about that over and over again. It's by the Berghoff Foundation, and it's on transitional justice. There is one episode focusing on youth in particular, and I recommend you to listen to it. And the speaker said, youth are the bearers of future memory on the importance of including youth in transitional justice processes. This is deeply, deeply important also in the matter of education that I will tackle next. It's my fourth point. So on education, I know other speakers tackled it already, but I have here in my notes the importance to fight neoliberal trends in educational systems. Social cohesion is not possible in countries where educational system is divisive and not inclusive. I have a very personal experience on this because I was born and raised in Brazil, and my family moved to Italy when I was 19. So I am Latin American, European, and I had the opportunity of having a scholarship in a private school. And in Brazil, and as I know, in lots of other countries in Latin America, education is largely a business. There are certain brands that are named as schools. And this is deeply troubling because it creates and reinforces power dynamics. Who benefits from the kind of education that you are giving? Again, on this, textbooks are vital and connected to the memory aspect that I mentioned before. When I was in high school, again, in this private school, I had a very good and treasured history teacher, and she was very much respected by my peers. When we were studying the military dictatorship, which was a dictatorship started by a coup in 1964, in our textbook, it said the revolution of 1964. And fortunately, she was a very respected professor. And she said, scratch this out. This was not a revolution. This was a coup. But I imagine that a lot of other aspects and a lot of these other situations happened in different contexts. So having a good quality investment and educational system is vital also for issues related to transitional justice and memory and peace education as well, which must be incorporated in every school. To peace education, especially in deeply unequal societies, such as the ones in Latin America, and I'm talking about the Brazilian context in specific, it's very important for young people to recognize from their youth their own privileges. Very, very, very important. And I know that this discussion has been more active recently, especially in the US as well. But when I was a kid, it wasn't. So I find that thoughts very, very close to my heart. The schools need to be spaces in which kids can have the difficult conversations facilitated by people who know how to do that. And this is at the core of peace education. My fifth point is, again, as already mentioned, support and invest in civilian prevention, de-escalation, and dialogue capabilities in different levels. So local, regional, national, and international. The communities are the ones that have the key role in identifying the threats and the key aspects and the key steps to be done after prevention and when threats are recognized, as well as the escalation tactics that are tailored to their own culture. This does not only relate to armed violence, but also extremism, polarization, and solving other issues, practical issues within the communities itself before individuals actually resort to violence. And be aware of the importance of national dialogue processes and supporting local stakeholder capabilities to hold them and maintain them. My sixth point is to ensure ownership of reconstruction and post-war recovery processes. Also connected to the trends in neoliberalization that I was mentioning in the educational sector, this is also a very important trend. So in the context of Ukraine, for example, there are several economic interests at stake. And it's deeply, deeply important that the civil society is brought on to the recovery plans, to the negotiating tables. Ukraine must not be a pie that's going to be divided by different parties. In order to ensure ownership, we need to have the presence of civil society on the ground, citizens, donors, international organizations, multi-stakeholder coordination spaces, and advocacy at different levels. So that to make sure the communities are heard and represented in the recovery plans. On that as well, focusing on social recovery, healing, psychosocial support, mental health, as mentioned, and the reintegration of the occupied territories, specifically now in the context of Ukraine, needs to be done in a very, very much conflict-sensitive manner. My seventh point is actually a systemic approach to countering climate change. In the issue of climate change, I believe that the point on the inconsistencies of our economic system is particularly a difficult thing to crack. And it is impossible, for instance, to think about fighting climate change and support environmental protection without bringing the indigenous populations and activists to the table and actually support their protection, because this is an incredibly dangerous work. On that note, also supporting environmental protection programs that are actually ethno-environmental. They support the communities as well. Fostering learning and exchange from indigenous and traditional populations in terms of ecosystem protection. These groups, these populations have millennial knowledge. It has been proven by research that they actually, the Amazon, for instance, is a result of gardening, of ecosystem protection. They know what they are doing. So we need to listen to them and to bring them to the table. And again, something that I needed to mention is that the Global South is already facing most of the consequences of climate change. So when dealing with the narrative and the discourse in climate change in Europe, we need to bring them to the table as well. Connected to that, my second point is to implement decolonial praxis in all the possible levels. I think that understanding the context you're working on is vital, and that happens by carrying out research. But there is no research without actively listening to the narrative of the people, of the affected populations on the ground. On the focusing on international organizations and donors, international NGOs implement actually checks and balance systems that work within EU organizations to ensure that the participants, the affected populations are listened to, and that they have ownership over the processes. In the worst of the cases, if you don't implement that, you will do harm. In the best of the cases, the positive changes that you're going to report are not going to be sustainable. My last point here would be that the Global South needs to be able to tell its own story and to think about itself, intellectual, culture, practice, invest in universities, invest in academics. They need to be able to tell their own story. But someone coming from the Global South, and in particular Brazil itself, that has just stepped out of extreme right-wing government, beware of nationalism. Let's learn our lessons from Europe and our vulnerability to propaganda. I was in Europe when the full-scale invasion of Ukraine started, and it was February, so we were preparing for Carnival. And some of people from the media and from the civil society were mentioning, well, how can you go and party at Carnival when there is actually war going on? This was a kind of a narrative and a kind of debate that was happening. And what I saw in extreme intensity and scale is, and I quote, "They never cry when we have problems. Why should we stop our national celebration because of this?" And as a Brazilian, I felt very ashamed, and as someone from the Global South that knows the very painful history of colonialism, I kind of understand that. So the pains of the Global South and the disasters that happen and our beauty and our knowledge needs to be seen. I think people need to be seen. Connected to the indigenous populations issue and protection that I mentioned before, we had a very serious humanitarian crisis that happened to the Yanomami population in the beginning of 2023. And I didn't see it in the European media. I didn't see it at all. Now the issue that is happening in Niger, also incredibly important, incredibly in terms of scale, it's going to affect the stability of a whole continent. I don't see it particularly taken care of and analyzed in the media. So these are discussions that we need to have Europe needs to have the very difficult conversations and self-analysis and discussion, and that goes into also the international cooperation, humanitarian peacebuilding sector. My last point is to improve the efficiency and the efficacy of the international system. So support a shift from national security to human security, as was mentioned before, for international organizations and donors, think tanks focusing on analysis, implement HDP nexus in programming and support on the ground. The United Nations Security Council reform is long overdue. There are a lot of issues and a lot of problems with that, but I won't get into it. But every time that I've been thinking about this for a long time, and every time that I think about it, it's just something that we really need to understand how to implement for the sake of the legitimacy of the UN. And finally, sorry, I have already spoken too much. Donors should make things easier and provide the structures so that spontaneous, self-organizing, and thriving civil society, as we have seen the civil society response in Ukraine, can be appropriately supported. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you for the work that you're doing with Peace Support Ukraine, actually on the ground level with Ukrainian youth, and reminding us again that young people are the ambassadors of peace and they should be the ones that we should work with, right, again. And plus talking about environmental peace, which after blowing up a Kakhovka water dam is also a big issue in Ukraine and should be considered and taken into account. We have two more brilliant speakers, and if those of you who can stay longer, we really encourage you and ask you to do so due to respect to the speakers who have spent a long time with us. And I want to introduce one more good friend of mine, amazing speaker, Mansouk Milton, who is a refugee as myself, only a refugee from South Sudan, but also inspiring individual coming from a community that has been impacted by the war and currently residing as a refugee in Uganda. In 2022, Mansouk had the privilege of being selected as a South Sudan Community Solutions Program Fellow, which is a prestigious program supported by the US Department of State. But also Mansouk co-founded the Youth Development Mission, a refugee community-led organization. And in this role, he currently passionately empowers young people, promotes peace-building initiatives, and advocates for grassroots solutions. He really plays a big role in creating opportunities for young refugees, enabling them to realize their full potential and to become agents of change within their community. Mansouk, I hope your connection is stable and you can take over the microphone now.
Thank you so much, Maria. Back here, they said if you are the last speaker, I'm not sure if I'm the last speaker, that you have all the time, you know, to to speak. My name is Mansouk Milton. I'm a refugee right now in South Sudan. I'm a father of two boys, and I know some of you are aware that, you know, South Sudan has been in war, civil war, for over 2 decades, and because of that war, that's why, you know, we are currently in Uganda as refugees, you know, to find refuge. And you know, I was born in the war, raised in the war, you know, got married in the war. The level as that war generation, but I feel like we've been really now positioned to build a peace generation, and with that, I don't really mean that peace generation is where there are no conflicts, you know, where there are no disagreement, but it is a place where, you know, we have, you know, the capacity to deal with whatever conflicts that will come on my way, on our ways. And I'm really very, very honored for the opportunity to be, you know, part of this event. You know, I am not bringing in my ideas from an expert perspective, but I'm coming from a refugee status, someone who has been impacted by the war, someone who has experienced war throughout his life. And I strongly believe the starting point for us really to have a sustainable peace is to really involve, just like what you have done, inviting me, you know, as a refugee, to have my say, you know, what kind of world do we want, you know, what kind of ideas do we want as people who have been impacted by this war. So I strongly believe, you know, for us to have such kind of conversation of, you know, having a peaceful world, you know, going beyond a world that there is no war, it is very, very important to involve people who have been impacted by the war, you know, people who have experienced the war, because they know exactly the kind of future that they dream about. So thank you so much for, you know, for giving this opportunity to bring in my ideas from that perspective. And one thing I've been thinking about is, you know, I took a 10-hour bus, you know, ride, and in the middle of the night, the bus broke, you know, had mechanical problem. And we are in the middle of nowhere, and you know, I was worried, plus many people. And so what happened actually, the tanboy got a toolbox with a lot of tools, and you know, they got out and started fixing the car, and within 30 minutes, you know, we are able to hit the road. Unfortunately, conflicts is inevitable, and you know, back here as South Sudanese, even as refugees, we are, you know, dealing with conflicts that we don't have the toolbox, we don't have the skills, you know, to handle these conflicts. So if we're thinking about really sustainable peace, it's very, very important, you know, for us to give the community, to give the people who are impacted by this war, to give the people who confront conflicts every day, the strategies, the skills, you know, the toolbox that they can, you know, deal with these conflicts on their daily basis. Because this is actually what we are right now facing. We have a lot of conflicts, you know, in different parts of South Sudan, and even in the camps, we have over, you know, 60 tribes, and we don't like each other, that, you know, tribal conflicts, but we don't have the toolbox, the skills, you know, to deal with these conflicts. So, you know, for the case of South Sudan, you know, for us to really have a sustainable peace, we need to be empowered. We need to be given this toolbox so that at the end of the day, when we come across these conflicts, we are able to deal with it. We're able to handle it positively before it will become a big community problem or a society problem. So this is something that, you know, from my own perspective, it can cast across. I strongly believe the world needs the toolbox, because conflict is inevitable. The world needs these strategies, these skills on how to deal with conflicts. And then the second thing I was thinking about, you know, Lord, something very important. In South Sudan, over 70%, you know, of the population are young people below the age of 30, you know, years. And we have rebel groups, you know, in South Sudan, many rebel groups, and most of the people who are used, you know, as war actors, war drivers, are actually young people. So I think we need now to start a conversation how, you know, young people who have so much potential, you know, so much energy, you know, how can we channel that energy into peace building? You know, how can we channel that energy into, you know, building the country that we want to see? So I strongly believe that we need to start this conversation, believing that there is no better, you know, country, peaceful country, better world, without really investing in the young people who are today's and future leaders. So with proper opportunities, the tools, I strongly believe we'll be able to achieve the sustainable peace that we are dreaming about. And that's exactly, you know, what we are doing here with the refugees, you know, here in the camps, the young people, having a conversation with them that, you know what, South Sudan is waiting for us. You know, South Sudan is counting for us. You know, we don't know when we are going back home, but till that time come, hopefully soon, we want to start building the country that all of us we dream about, the country that we want to go back to. We want to start building it right now. and we are giving them the opportunities, we are giving them the tools, we are giving them the space to grow as leaders who will one day go back home and reshape our country. And I strongly believe this can apply anywhere. Youth have so much potential, so much energy, but the problem is they're being manipulated, exploited as drivers in war. And finally, from experience, for me, I think you cannot think about a world beyond war without really repairing the harm that have been caused by the war. South Sudan people are bleeding. South Sudan people are hurt. South Sudan people, have lost, even personally, I've lost many people. And South Sudan people are struggling with revenge. There are people who are even thinking, when I get back home, I'm going to look for the people who killed my relatives, my parents. So there is no way we can have a conversation about having a world beyond war or having a sustainable peace without really creating an opportunity, without, someone mentioned about restorative justice, and reconciliation initiatives where there is a space for these people who have been impacted by this war, to heal, this harm needs to be repaired so that they have the resiliency, to come to this space where they can have this conversation. So that's my perspective as a refugee, that it is very important for people who have been impacted by the war to be given a space to heal for their pain, the harm that has been done. They need that opportunity. They need a conversation about that so that it is repaired. Otherwise, there is no way we can face the future with our past, with our pain. So these are some of my few perspective, but I want to say, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to bring in my perspective. And it takes all of us, to build the world that we want to, and we all dream about, for our children. And thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to be part of this event. And lastly, I want to take this opportunity to thank my friend Maria and Lauro and a team from River Phoenix Center for Peace Building. They were able to come to Uganda and train us on strategies like dialogue. Right now we have conflicts between the refugee and the host community. So there is no, strong relationships. We don't know when we are going back. So it's very, very important for us to have good relationship with these people who are hosting us. But that has been tempered with. So having skills, having strategies, on dialogue, it gives us, we are empowered to have a space where we can sort out our issues, through dialogue. And recently we conducted a dialogue between the host community and the refugee using the strategies as Maria, Laura and the River Phoenix Center of Peace team trained us a few months ago. So I want to use this opportunity really to say thank you. And we will continue to need to ask for more trainings. We need this toolbox, and because we have conflicts in our families, in our communities, that we don't have the toolbox, the strategies, the right skills to deal with them. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mansuk. I know you talked about the toolbox and being able to empower the others, but you are already a role model and you are the change maker on the ground. I've seen your work, so I deeply appreciate what you are doing for your people, and that one day you'll be able to go home, back to your country, just as Ukrainians are hoping to go back to our country, and we finally will have peace. So thank you so much for your passion and dedication to your country.
Thank you.
And As Mansuk said, the last but not the least, who has the power to hold the discussions for as long as she wants, we have also Laura and now joining us. And again, I'm sorry, Laura, that we took a lot of time today, but I wanted just to introduce you briefly. Laura is a United States Institute of Peace consultant on peace and security. She was a senior project officer at USAP and led dialogues between security and justice institutions and rural communities in Colombia. Laura is part of the Violence, Peace and State Building Research Group of the Colombian National NGO, and she has been a consultant to national and international organizations that work for peace and has published in different academic and advocacy media. Please, Laura, the microphone is yours.
Thank you so much, Maria, and I'm glad to be here. I'm the last person, so I'm going to be brief. But I do want to share like my solidarity with all of the people, not only in Ukraine, that are facing war right now. I am from Colombia. This is a country that have had a protracted armed conflict for more than 60 years. And still we have a strong civil society that is doing a lot of interesting things that I want to share with you today. So basically, I'm going to speak mostly about Latin America and Colombia. And one of the main challenges that I am seeing so far that we are going to have to face in the near future is related to the derogation of the state capacity and willingness to actually protect human rights and to include all of the people, all of the marginalized people. For instance, indigenous people, peasant communities, rural inhabitants, young people, or women. And in addition to that, or simultaneously, I think that we are facing, at least this is for me more evident in Latin America, and a power or an increasing of power of the organized crime and the gangs. And what is interesting, or that what is an obstacle for me, is that for one side you have the derogation of the state capacity, and at the same time you have the strengthening of the power of illegal groups that are actually conducting criminal governance, because they do have the political power, social power, so they are basically acting like states but under criminality. So if you have this cocktail, and I think that we are going to have to face this internationally, not only in the region of Latin America. So for me, we should focus on the strengthening of the capacity of the capacities of the civil society, because we are doing so much so far. And we are not going to count on the states, because I do see this derogation of the states' capacities. So my message, I'm only going to give this recommendation because this is something that I have been doing for the last 10 years, but it's basically focusing on the local level. In Colombia, we have a lot of national peace processes that, of course, I support. We had processes with one of the most ancient guerrillas of times, which is the FARC. Right now, we are having conversations or negotiations with the ELN and other guerrilla groups, and with organized crime, all of them at the same time. But I think that we keep forgetting the importance of the people at the local level. So this is what I have been doing, strengthening the capacities of people at the local level to do negotiation, dialogue, and mediations, and trying to solve the everyday conflicts they have. Because in addition to the national conflict, you have all of the consequences actually at the local level. So this is like a very basic message, but for me, like, the international cooperation should consider the capacity building that already exists at the local level and focus on that, because I think that I do believe in that if we all act together, but if everyone is able to manage their own conflict, at the end we are going to give or support a more national peace process. But for me, that's like the key message. Like, we should focus at the local level, and we should keep strengthening the capacities of those of the civil society, who is already doing a lot for the everyday peace. I'm going to leave it there, Maria, to continue the conversation other time.
Thank you so much, Laura. And again, highlighting the importance of engaging at the local level with the people who are and being directly impacted, but also raising awareness that the local ownership is the most important element if you want to build sustainable peace. I'm quite aware that we are 25 minutes overdue of our second session, but I really want to allow a space for the discussions. For those of you who have time to stay a bit longer, it both concerns the speakers, but also the participants. I understand that the value of such event is to actually have a more deeper engagement with each other and try to hear the other perspectives. So I see there is a raised hand. Andrea, would you like to raise your question? And you are muted, Andre.
Hello? You hear me? Good. Thank you. It's a very interesting and intense meeting. I would say probably next time we need to have more time for discussions, because very many statements are, very interesting and certainly also maybe somewhat controversial. So it's important to have in the future, if things like that are organized, they need to be organized, I think, be a little more interactive. I wanted to stress a few points. My name is Andrei Kamenchik. I'm based in Kiev, Ukraine. I represent, I'm the regional coordinator for the Global Partnership for Prevention of Armed Conflict, or GPAC. And what I would like to mention, something that really concerns me, is that I heard today some what I think is let's say some uncertainty between peace building and appeasement. We all have very good intentions, but if we want to be effective in peace building, we need to also be able to directly and clearly confront in the situation and speak about the situation as it is. If we use various previous mistakes by different countries, including the US and NATO and so forth, in the context to explain the current tragedy, the Russian aggression, Putin's aggression against Ukraine, I think that will just, that won't bring us closer to peace. It will take us further away. That does not mean that there have not been serious mistakes made in many cases, war in Iraq, whole affair of Yugoslavia, Kosovo was self-proclaimed independence was recognized, though there was, it was basically in violation of international law and so forth. Complicated cases, but there's no. This cannot be used to in the current context of Ukraine to try to explain or somehow, call for better understanding of Putin. And something that I would like to say is that what we need to speak. I know that it's important to understand. To better understand what's going on. But I think that what we should call is not for us to be able to address the interest. When we speak about the interests of Russia, we often actually mean the interests of Putin. In my mind, the interests of Russia are the interests of Russian people that are generally absolutely directly against the interest of the criminal fascist. In my mind, I can say that because I'm half Russian myself, and I lived in that country most of my life, of the government that we see today in Moscow. And I think that we need to be very clear on that. And does that mean that we have to just, as peace builders, sit aside and not do anything and say, okay, let's just let things go the way they go? No, there is a lot that can be done, but we should try to use our energy not to I would say not to try to find excuses and understandings and find compromises with the government in Moscow today, but rather try to reach out to the people of Russia and try to work also with Ukrainian society that is making, I think sometimes the Ukrainian government and society is sometimes making serious mistakes in terms of, they do not also often see the difference between the Russian people and the government in Moscow. And as a result, they miss the opportunity to reach out to tens of millions of people in Russia who are in opposition, clear opposition to the current government. And they often lose opportunities to effectively speak to the so-called silent majority of the Russian people that maybe are complacent, maybe go along with what is going on, but in the majority are not in any way actually directly interested or in supporting this war. So there's a lot that can be done constructively, but it shouldn't be done under I think we should keep this division between the population of Russia and the government itself very clear, and not speak about, when we speak about Russian interest, we shouldn't take the proclaimed interest of the Putin government as Russian interests. These are very different things. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea, for your intervention and for bringing your perspective. I see that we have another hand. I'm sorry if I pronounce your name wrong, Steiner Brin. Would you like to unmute yourself and address your question or comment? And you are muted. You have to unmute yourself.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes. I'm from Norway. I've been working for 25 years with ethnic conflicts in particularly ex-Yugoslavia, Kosovo, Bosnia, Croatia, Serbia, Macedonia. And when the war started in Ukraine, I started traveling a lot, and it was obvious similarities in terms of ethnic differences not causing the conflict, but being somehow strengthened or increasing during the conflict. And I have many friends now in Ukraine that are worried about, because it's not like a war between Ukraine and Ukrainians on one side and Russians and Russia on the other side. Europe is so intermixed. If we took DNA tests in Bosnia or Kosovo, or for that matter in Ukraine, or for that matter, in Norway and Sweden, we are all somehow intermixed. So what I'm deeply worried about is, how are we going to reconcile after the war is over between the people, that living together, how to build a society for all, because I don't see the plan. I see an increasing nationalism, and that is often the result of every war that I've seen in Europe since, time started. And it is so important that we learn from the past in such a way. And I can give you just one example. A very good friend of mine, he became minister for war veterans in Croatia. And then he says, we have now won the war. We will have a democracy in Croatia, and all Croatian citizens have the same right for war compensation. After saying that, he needed the bodyguard for 3 years. Because of course not all citizens are equal. But that is what a democracy is all about. And the war between Ukraine and Russia has developed into so much a hate war. Ukrainians fighting everything Russian, Russia fighting everything Ukrainian, and how can we somehow build a bridge? And I want to say something which is completely politically incorrect, something that you wouldn't even say on internet like this, but we always keep saying, Ukrainians must decide what is about Ukraine. No. When we have experience from similar conflicts in Kosovo, in Bosnia, in Croatia, in Serbia, in Macedonia, people from these areas have experiences that can be helpful in terms of rebuilding bilingual schools, in terms of rebuilding bilingual communities, in terms of making it possible to move back to your neighborhood where you live together with those you actually have been in a war with. And this is such a tough job that to think this is the Ukrainians' responsibility alone is wrong from my experience. And there are people with similar experiences that can be very helpful. That was my point.
Thank you so much for such a valid point, and again for reminding what Ukrainians really feel when being stuck into this war that we did not ask upon ourselves. And with that, I'm going to pass the moderation of the event and further questions for Kai, because I also have the other engagement that I have to be present at. But thank you so much for excellent presentations, but also the discussion that starts right now and comments in the chat box. We'll make sure to have an additional event where we can actually engage all of the participants in more fruitful discussion, or as I would prefer, a dialogue where we can really explore in depth what really peace building is. So the microphone is yours, Kai.
Thank you so much, Maria. Dziękuję, spasiba. Thank you for being with us. I first want to thank everyone who has stayed. And as some saw in the chat, I and Maria were also apologizing. We had originally 3 speakers with 10 minutes each, and then 20 plus minutes for conversation, and then 4 speakers in the second part. More and more people were confirming. We added more speakers, and it did what we do not wish to, which was go speaker heavy, less space for discussion. We apologize and we say sorry for that, but we also say thank you for staying and for the conversation we'll have now. And as we also wrote in the chat, we will organize a follow-up event to really focus on practical conversation and dialogue and planning for what can be done. Having just said that we've been speaking too much, I'm going to ask for your understanding for a moment, because I just want to say thank you to Steinar, because it was 27 years ago when he gave me an opportunity to take part in an incredible program that he gave vision and life to, in the Democracy, Human Rights, and Peaceful Conflict Resolution program in Lillehammer, Norway. And that opportunity that he gave to a young child was part of what created the space for working in peace building the last 26 years. We're speaking about so many levels of what we're facing in our world today. And some of what we're speaking about is the need to also look at systems solutions and to realize this isn't just about what's happening in Ukraine, but it's much broader. But I also wanted to get back to that difference that one person can also make in standing up with courage like Mansuk does, in creating space, in what all of us here can do. And that's what I'd really like to invite us to move to in the conversation, to really look at what can we do. I do also just want to share, because we've been on the ground in Ukraine since 2009, and then engaging much more since the war began. But this dynamic that Steinar just spoke of, there is amazing heroism, there is amazing resilience, but there are some really toxic, destructive, dangerous elements of what's happening in Ukraine as well. There's the trauma of a population living through war. There's so many millions of Ukrainians who are wanting to build a better future in their country, but with the funneling of weapons, the combat, there is a strengthening and an understandable trauma from the war. You have some strands that are saying, you know, Russian is the language of the enemy. True patriots speak Ukrainian. And the reality is Ukraine is a very diverse society. So there will be a need for support to make sure that when people say, let local voices decide, or let the people of Ukraine decide, to realize that you can sometimes have a dictatorship of one group and majority over those whose voices we don't like. And you even have a threatening and intimidation taking place in Ukraine today, where peace workers don't support the party line of one very prominent individual and the group being created around that. And they are bullied and they are harassed. And so you have gatekeeping, whereas in reality in Ukraine, as in Russia, as in Belarus, as in all of our own countries, our societies are diverse. There's so many different people, and there are a lot in Ukraine as well who really want help and assistance in the incredibly difficult challenge of building an authentic peace and healing in their country beyond the war. Let's open up for discussions. In a situation like this, it's natural that there are different viewpoints on different issues. And often where, as Richard and I were just writing, we may often agree on 80, 90, or even 100%, but we have difference on some, and that's not negative. We want to create a space to hear each other's different views and hopefully together be able to see more concretely what practical action and what we can do forward. So I'd like to open the floor, whoever wishes to share. You can use the raise hand function, or you can just type into the chat that you wish to speak, and let's hear from us together.
Thank you, Kai. Thank you.
Tusen tack, Steinar. Please, Teresa.
So I want to, first of all, have greetings from Canada. I belong to longstanding peace builders such as Ben Hoffman, and who has passed away, but still belong to CN, and to Civilian Peace Service Canada, Canadian Peace Initiative, the Group of 78. There's so many different organizations that want peace, and yet I find it very difficult to get these groups to actually give a common voice to there needs to be a peace process. And what we've experienced, and I've certainly experienced, is that there in Canada is no recognition of planning for peace as part of our international affairs. So yes, I mean, I find it very disheartening, as people have expressed, to even be able to give support to a peace process. I've had people from these organizations who have worked very hard to have alternatives to war say, oh, we have to just let the ones who are on the ground work it through because they know better of what to do. And I fiercely feel that is not true. When we have worked with our politicians, and I have international experience, but mostly Canadian, like I feel confident speaking about Canadian politics and that. So when we've spoken to all of our politicians, regardless of even their sensitivities towards peace, they absolutely do not know and have the tools that Mansouk was talking about needed on the grassroots. They did not know about nonviolent peace options. They did not know about how to be strong in negotiations, because clearly this approach is not about appeasement. Whenever I've worked in this, no matter in what realm or whoever I've worked with, it takes a lot more courage to do a peace building process, because you do have to face not only the pain that you have been that you have experienced, but the pain that you have incurred. So it is a very courageous option, and people must be much more responsible and accountable to their actions. So I want to say that it is, I'm looking for the options to from my really small little environment to inspire more people to say, regardless of our individual beliefs or approaches or whatever, we do not support killing as a way of resolving a problem. I want support in being able to, I know that the last group I attended is now having a week long, they're asking people around the world to stand firm that from September 30th to October 8th, we want to present a declaration that says we want a peace process to this. We want to stop the war. We want to stop all wars as a way of solving political, for anything, but certainly for solving political issues. So that's one of the reasons I'm here. And I also have lots of good strategies that I believe would be important to bring to this. I am not unfamiliar with the things that people have discussed today. So how to overcome this inordinate amount of power that our political leaders have that is unaccountable and can be very unhealthy and abusive, and yet we have no process to address them in Canada, or as I can see, anywhere. So yeah, that's what I'm here for, and I'm going to stay so we can have as much discussion as possible.
Thank you so much, Teresa. I've put it in the chat just to invite and ask people, please really do take part actively in conversation. You can write that you'd like to speak in the chat as Teresa did, or raise the hand function, the button, as Richard has just done. We'd really like to invite people to also try together to find answers to those questions that Teresa has raised now, and to the ideas and questions that have come up from the presentations and from the chat as well. Please, Richard.
Thank you. I just want to follow up what Teresa said, because one way of looking at this challenge.
Not Richard.
Pardon? Okay. One way of looking at this challenge is to see it as it's a challenge of democracy, as well as war and peace. It's democracy. We're living in societies in which government has too much power and people too little. The comment earlier about the interests of Russia not being the same as the interests of the Russian regime, which is certainly true, but could also be made of Canada or the United States. So then it becomes important to ask, well, what are the opportunities that civil society offers for us to make our voices heard, and to do a kind of peace education that's not simply something that's happening in schools, but that's happening in community organizations and churches and synagogues and mosques and all sorts of interest group organizations. Recently, with our people at the Carter School, we're now involved in discussions with a fraternal organization or sororal organization called Rotary International, which you probably know is a large international organization that has a long-term interest in peace, but it hasn't had the facilities to do much about that, except on an ad hoc basis. So we're talking with them about, well, how could that organization become much more systematically and effectively involved in peacemaking, peace-building activities around the world? That's a kind of long-term project, but I'm thinking more and more, my colleagues and I are finding more and more that if we go out into the community and talk to people, whether they're in community organizations, churches, fraternal organizations, or whatever, people are actually interested in these topics. They want to talk about them, so it's not an immediate solution to the problem of Ukraine, but it's something that's happening. I think that could become very important over time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. Would others like to follow on in the conversation? And again, we can use the chat space for writing and sharing ideas and questions as well, for any who feel most comfortable there. Joyce, you looked like you were about to say something.
I just had a short thought about the string about supporting Russian resistors. Actually, we should also say resistors in Belarus and in Ukraine who are non-violent resistors. From what I know, even Russian deserters who supposedly should be taken in as refugees in European countries and in the United States that is not really done, and lobbying all our countries to respect the right for people and to shelter and defend the people who do not participate in the war seems to me something we can do, because if someone's brave enough to not participate and left to their own devices, many people are stranded in Georgia, for instance. But just that thought.
Thanks, Joyce. So some of the exceptional work which Andre is involved in is actually going directly to visit with Russian men who are in Georgia, Armenia, other countries in the region, and to try and work with them to see how they can use their channels to strengthen opposition inside Russia. But you're exactly correct. There was a moment where in Europe, we were advocating for the European Union to officially offer asylum for all Russian combatants, everyone who would step away from and refuse to take part in a criminal war. And that would have been one of the most effective measures to end the war as quickly as possible. And there was a nonsensical or absurdist argument when many Russian men were leaving during the draft, where it was said that if we allow them into our countries, then that will become a security threat. And that is what actually then became the mantra and was organized and supported, and the reason why why the EU effectively closed its borders. But the reality was the entire concept was absolutely absurd. If Russia wants to carry out operations inside the EU, it can do so easily. They have enough EU passports that are held by Russian intelligence services and operatives. They have enough operatives across the continent that if they wish to do that, they do. It's not an issue of those who are coming in. But we have not really looked at how can we support that resistance. But also, you mentioned something that I want to flag for all of us, whatever ideas we come up with here, this aspect of coordinated lobbying of our countries. Just to give a very clear example shortly, we've been traveling to countries across Europe and especially inside Ukraine primarily, and helping to make visible the need for support on dealing with trauma recovery, on introducing trauma-informed education in schools, on introducing social recovery, local level peace building programs, not only in physical recovery, not only physical reconstruction, but community and national level peace efforts inside Ukraine. And for most of the embassies and others we spoke with, this was not on their agenda. This was not on their horizon at all, but it became that way. And now, just as one example, meeting with the Swedish ambassador the week before last in Bucharest, the Swedish embassy wants to organize an event with all of the EU ambassadors for us to brief them on peace and security implications of the war and what can be done for peace building. Now, imagine if we were to work with some concrete proposals and to actively engage in advocacy, going to our home governments and going to the embassies in each of our countries. So I go to your embassy here, you go to my embassy there, and we begin to do collaborative, coordinated advocacy on concrete, practical recommendations. Thank you so much for that point, Joyce. Diana and then Steinar, please. And if others wish to speak, please let us know either through the hand or in the chat. Please, Diana.
Hello. Thank you for being invited to such an event. And I'm honestly, I feel a bit offended as Ukrainian about what you guys were talking about, because the event is called about peace building in Ukraine. And what I hear is mostly about how to help Russians, how to find opposition, how to help them to help themselves. If you don't see such opposition, like on horizontal, why are you looking for it in the first place? Also, about the second moment, it was mentioned that a lot of governments do not really know how to help Ukraine and how to make this peace, especially in a diplomatic way, let's say. Well, maybe like a small recommendation. When you do not know how to act and how to do something for Ukraine, ask Ukrainians. They will tell you how to help them, like directly. When you do not know what to do, go to Ukrainians, ask. We'll tell you. And about such events, I would really ask to invite a little bit more Ukrainians to provide you with some information. Because when it is said that the majority of Ukrainians are, how it was mentioned, are demanding for the minority like to speak Ukrainian, or other stuff. It was said by Steiner. Like, I would really ask to not to get into our inner politics. We would figure it out. And speaking about peace building, I would really appreciate if in the future, Ukraine would be more discussed than Russian opponents, and how to help them with saving their country. Because let's finish the war first. Let's stop our people from dying. Let's concentrate on what our topic is about, at least. Thank you.
Diana, dziękuję. Firstly, thank you so much for your comments and for taking part today as well. Some things that I would just like to share to make sure that it's clear for all. So Diana, firstly, this is about the 25th webinar that we have organized. And it is only the second where we are inviting international perspectives on how to address the broader implications. On the others, it has always been speakers primarily from within Ukraine that have been involved in raising and bringing forward the breadth of issues that they face. The second aspect is the focus today is on tackling the war in Ukraine and its implication for all of our countries and rising global violence. And part of what we wanted to make sure is to bring in also speakers from around the world, because Ukraine has received far more attention than any other conflict and war-affected area, even while often the war is not as devastating as it is in many others. Now, I've been on the ground in Ukraine, and you cannot underestimate or unspeak of how devastating the war is. But there are countries where hundreds of thousands and millions have also been killed and which have faced extraordinary destruction that do not have the attention to support the allyship or aid which Ukraine is receiving, while the dynamics of war are increasing globally. And we want to look at it within that context, what we can all do as citizens to affect the rise of this violence. Just on the two important points that you raised, I would want to share. Anyone who is in any way sincere or authentic about wanting to end the Russian invasion in Ukraine needs to get serious and be intelligent and honest about how to bring about an end of that invasion. And anyone with any degree of military or strategic knowledge knows that when you can transition and have opposition to the war from within the military itself, or people refusing to fight, that is critical. We're not discussing it in the absence of other components, but no one is honest or serious about wanting the war to end if they aren't also engaging with how to get the Russian population or key strategic actors. All you need is less than 2.5 to 3% of the population to actively engage in resistance. But the problem is most people don't know that. They're naive or profoundly ignorant about reality and about how opposition takes place. When we're saying why look for opposition if it isn't there, anyone who knows anything about Russia, polling in Russia, conditions in Russia, know that up to 50% of the young population does not actively support the war. Many are very uncomfortable with it. If you meet with business people in Dubai, in Shanghai, in other areas, they will openly discuss in closed spaces how disgusted and sickened they are by the war. But a problem is we have a massive degree of ignorance and naivete about resistance. And it's understandable, for example, in Ukraine, when people are angry that more people in Russia aren't standing up. But there has almost never been a war in modern history where you had people standing up very quickly from the beginning and saying we have to end this war. That just doesn't happen as someone who's worked in it for decades. And any knowledge of Russia also leads us to understand this is a country with a deep history of authoritarianism, where resistance and democratic movements have been persecuted and beaten down. Opposition politicians have been assassinated. Journalists have been killed. Human rights workers, women's groups, feminists, students are persecuted. So this is coming from people with decades of experience in organizing resistance. I've done training under military regimes and been shot at in these contexts of what it takes to actively organize. And we are definitely not saying it's the only front, but if anyone is sincere to wanting to end the war, it is a critical front as well. And I just to own, because I think it was myself and not Steiner who said, I said a small strand in Ukraine is saying that, not that it's the majority of the population. It is a small strand, but it is coming out, that component. And it's something which Ukrainian friends and allies have spoken to and are raising. Thank you very much. But I just wanted to put into context where those came from and not have the misattribution. Dziękuję, Diana. And I hope we carry the conversation further. I have such respect and
I will
appreciation
hit
for
up
what you're
later.
doing.
Thank you.
Thank you. Please, Steiner, and then Andre, and I will shut up and just facilitate going forward. My apologies.
Oh, Diana, I think we completely 100% agree on the importance of stopping the war, supporting the Ukrainian civilian population to rebuild the country in a democratic way. I am asking a few questions about whether the way we in the West are supporting the Ukrainian civil society in the best possible way. We have in the West, we had a great critique of the way we supported civil society in other countries, and we realized we have failed. We pretty much failed in Kosovo. We failed in Bosnia. We failed in Afghanistan. We failed in Libya. And we really do not have a plan now in Ukraine, except providing weapons and money and supporting as long as it takes. But to rebuild peace, it's not only about winning the war, it's also about how to build that peace. And we need more discussions about creative solutions. And let me just throw in as a kind of constructive proposal. We are trying to solve all kind of conflicts very much with the 20th century thinking about identity, about ethnicity, about territory, about statehood, citizenship, etc. I think we somehow need to rethink all these concepts, because whether we talk about Kosovo, Serbia, whether we talk about Caledonia, whether we talk about, we need to somehow think about how we can make a future together. And ethnicity is actually becoming part of the problem. It's a kind of an invention. So I'm inviting all of you here present today to somehow, and Kai, could we make a seminar conversation where we really try to rethink these very concepts, because they might be in the way of finding solutions that are acceptable in order to stop the war. And Diana, I just want to tell you, I'm coming from the Nansen Academy in Lillehammer, and my position is no more war. The brutality of the war, the consequences of the war. I've been working for 25 years in Bosnia, in Kosovo, in Croatia, Macedonia, with the consequences of war, and they are so brutal. I might be biased because I am really thinking we have to do everything we can to stop this war in Ukraine, and I do think we can. I do think we even have the negotiation results when European Union, NATO, United States, and China are part of finding the negotiation. And look at Dayton in Bosnia 30 years ago, exactly on this day, actually yesterday. They came up with a proposal for peace. It was denied. Why are we having a war if we're going to negotiate a peace? We have a war to win. They denied the peace agreement by the father of Jens Stoltenberg, now the head of NATO. 2 years later, they accepted the peace plan, pretty similar to what the father of Stoltenberg proposed. But in the meantime, you had Srebrenica and the destruction of 2 more years of war. My argument, I might be wrong. I'm not sure I'm right. But I think that the negotiated deal that Russia, Ukraine can make tomorrow will be very similar to the one they can make in 1 year or 2 years, or maybe could have made 1 year ago. The negotiation is not about the battlefield. If you study the history of the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina, it was the negotiation deal that decided the outcome on the battlefield, the other way around. Thank you.
I just wanted to think, and I will let Andre take the word, and we'll comment later. Thank
you. Please, Diana, you can say, please.
I wanted to let Andre to like continue and then make my conclusion if it's possible. I guess it's like it would be better. Thanks.
That would be perfect if that's what you feel good with. So please, Andre, and then Diana, and this is my young son Carl Gustav who's joining us.
I think that we should be clear. There's a certain problem that comes from ambiguity in language. When people speak about stopping war, using their best intentions, they're not always understood in Ukraine because Ukrainian society doesn't speak about stopping war. It speaks about winning the war. That's a major, major difference. Now, as peace builders, I believe that we can do a lot to make this kind of outcome faster, less violent, less costly in human lives and human suffering. And there is a lot that can be done. And there is a lot of very useful international experience that can be used. And there's a lot that Ukrainian society can learn from that experience. But we need to understand that stopping the war in the current situation probably will not serve the long-term goals of peace, because today, if we just stop on the front lines that we have today, this would be seen as a defeat by the majority of Ukrainian society. Even if it will be forced to accept that, it will be an extremely difficult, traumatic experience. And today, Ukrainian society is simply not prepared for it. I would also like to clarify that discussion about working with Russian society, and I know that this is a topic that is not always recognized, the importance of it is not always recognized or not properly heard in Ukraine. It's not about helping Russia. It's about the same thing. It's about helping Ukraine win this war and win it with, it's about saving Ukrainian lives. Because if you can split your enemy, if you can make your enemy focus on internal issues, then you're gonna be more effective, even from a simple perspective on a battlefield. And my own experience, over 30 years in this field of civil peace building tells me that a decisive factor in the outcome of any military conflict of today is the psychological, the moral factor, the motivation of people. And we should be able to work not only in terms of motivation internally in the country, but we should also, if we want to be effective, we need to understand what motivates people on the other side. And in that sense, it's not always simple. It takes some it's challenging, and it takes some effort. That if we can better understand the motivation of people on the other side, then we can develop the messages and the approaches that will be more effective. So that's something that's a separate long discussion. I can go for a long time about that, but we don't have time for that. So
thank you very much.
Things should be clarified. Thanks.
Thank you, Andre. And I want to turn over to Diana, and thank you, Diana. Just for one moment as moderator, I'd like to make a point of clarification to try and help people from different backgrounds and contexts understand. When it is said that Ukrainians speak about winning the war, what's very important for people who haven't had the opportunity to meet, speak, be involved on the ground and with people from Ukraine is what people mean is to survive. What people mean is to stop what they feel is a war of threat and extermination. So we're not talking about revanchism or by Ukrainians saying they want to win the war, meaning they want to attack and defeat and go into Russia. It is about a very felt experience, existential, wanting to survive and to prevent the atrocities and destruction which they have been experiencing. So that is the context in which that expression is used. I also just want to flag when Andre was speaking about morale and psychology, if you look at the extraordinary offensive that was carried out by Ukrainian forces last year, 1 year ago, end of summer through the autumn, we look at the element of surprise, we look at the coordination of forces on the front, we look at many things, but a fundamental reality of why it was able to take such area so quickly was that the vast, overwhelming Russian forces did not fight. They dropped their weapons and ran. And that was because of disorganization, low morale, bad leadership. But it was the non-engagement of forces through many reasons, which was a contributing factor. And that's an example of the point. Diana, please.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to thank you all and also for this event and just about speaking about Ukrainian topic and about peace building. And I know that Ukraine is helped much more times than any other country, and we much appreciate it. I'm currently in Bosnia, so just off topic, but yeah. I just wanted to not the whole angle to curve the angle and not it to be focus on looking for how to help Russia and Russians and how to look for the opponents, but to help us, because when we're looking for somebody
I think, Diana, I don't know if you hear us. It's frozen for a moment.
Like an actual war. This how. Yeah, I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. You're back now, Diana. There was just a lag. We lost you for a moment. Now we hear you clearly again.
I still want to be engaged despite bad connection. Thank you. Me personally, as a political scientist, I never believed that the actual full-scale war can be real. Because it's nuts, it's nonsense, it's unbelievable. Not to say we're not really prepared, but mentally it was difficult to believe because we were ready to negotiate, to go diplomatic way, but as we were able to see that it's all about the battlefields and how it is going on over there and how we see the winning of all our territories back, when not our people are back, not our children who were stolen are back, when not Russia is not held accountable for what it's done, when we have no tools of how to prevent ourselves from any other possible in future, and these topics. So even for us, it is difficult to say what winning is, because getting to the territories that were like back in 23rd of February 2022 is not the actual winning, because we don't want the frozen conflict for decades. We want to get our people back, our territory back, and just to develop and build our country. That's all we want. That's all we need. We don't want to fight. We would love to not to, really. And we would love to talk and do whatever. That's why we're seeking for any help and for any sources and for any platforms and anything to just gather together and come up to the certain conclusion and some maybe variants or anything to end this up from all of the perspectives and all of the sides, to tie it up and not to let it happen ever again. The world, because it's not it just has not to happen, never. That's why I really appreciate that this platform exists, that people are engaged from different areas, But all I'm asking about that's for you to engage Ukrainians so they can give you the perspective from different sides, because even working in the parliament, I cannot speak from the front line. I don't feel like I am responsible or have any right to speak for our soldiers and for anything that is happening there, because I'm not there. So yes, maybe we're biased, of course, but we can provide you with actual data, facts, and the most needed pages that we see like up to date currently right now this day that are of the biggest need, so we can concentrate on this, try to solve this, and come to some other topics, not to lose our time, because as we have already seen that we have lost a lot of time also with weapons and with other stuff. Not to say that we're complaining, but it's the time means people, means number of the people who are dead. Yeah, I'm sorry for being too sensitive, but I'm just grateful that such people exist that want to help and to build for to fight for democracy. Because how can we show that our values are good and are those that we should have and lead when they can be this easily destroyed, and when somebody can go against the rules and break all of the rules and not to be held responsible and accountable? We just cannot let it happen. Thank you.
Дякую. Thank you, Diana. Steiner, please. Steiner, you're on mute at the moment.
Diana, I just wanted to make sure that at least you don't misunderstand my approach. I have been visiting Ukraine, I think around 20 times. It started after the fire in Odessa, and I went to a lot of meetings with very polarized parts of the population. We invited Russians, Ukrainians to come to our Nansen Academy in Lillehammer for several years. This stopped when the war started. And I fully understand that I cannot understand the war from the ground in Ukraine. I need to listen to you. I need to listen to all the friends I've gained over all these years. Some of those friends, they tell me, Steinar, you don't understand what we are going through, but you have a helicopter view. You can see a few things from that helicopter that we cannot see from the ground. Therefore, it's important that we talk together. And you have some experience from what it's like to rebuild schools where students talk different languages, to move back into communities where people actually burn down each other's houses, where people were fighting. So I am only arguing that we are together in this. We are friends in this. I am very well aware of the kind of tension between the dialogue community within Ukraine and the international mediation, so forth. People in the world have done a lot of mistakes when they try to go in and tell people what to do. Maybe a place to start, it could be a good place to start, would be to have a dialogue between people like us sitting here today and the dialogue community in Ukraine to somehow make sure that we have some kind of a common base, because I feel convinced that absolutely we want the same. We want a peaceful Ukraine that can rebuild democracy and integrate peacefully into Europe. We agree on that. I just feel very uncomfortable with the way things are going right now, because within my country, I feel we are pushing the war to keep the war going, and I don't see any plan for ending the war. So my position is I'm deeply worried about the pain, the catastrophes we will see the next half year, the next year. That is my basis for having a very strong, we have to stop the war position. Thank you.
Teresa, you were saying you have to leave. I wonder if you have just a moment more, just to share. The many actors, I think some still in this call, some were with us earlier, were involved in a gathering that was organized in Rome last year. And it was brought about to see what role can the Catholic Church play in our world today when we're experiencing so much violence and so much war on many levels. And not only the violence and war of what we see in Ukraine, in Niger, in Syria and other countries, but also the extraordinary violence and war of our economic system and of our systematic organized destruction of the world's life system and ecological system worldwide. And one of the points that came up there when discussing about the war in Ukraine specifically is, while we are all focusing now on the waging of the war, the happening of the war, we also have to realize how important it is that we are running the risk of losing the peace to come. And when Diana, you powerfully say we cannot have this happen again and we need accountability, exactly. So for example, after the invasion and the war in Iraq, a war which started wars in the region that has led to the deaths of more than 2 million people, or the brutalities we've seen in many countries. The current director of crisis of the International Response Committee, David Miliband, and many others have spoken about the risk we're facing in the world where we lack accountability, where we don't hold accountable. In some ways, there's the potential that the current war in Ukraine could be the small war. Imagine this war ends, but Putin is still in power in Moscow. The remilitarization and armament and confrontation we'll see in Europe. But even then, Russia is quite small compared to the growing confrontation we see between the United States and China and the vast militarization in Asia. And therefore, while we must focus every effort, as I said earlier, to realize we're not talking about a war or crisis that might happen. We are in the midst of that war and crisis in Ukraine and globally. We need to see what can be done now to end that war and to end the system of militarism and war that has grown so terribly in the last decades. There's an old quote from the founder of Amnesty International: "It is better to light a candle than to curse the darkness." What we are trying to do is to stand in solidarity with all the people who are living through and affected by the terrorism and the terror of war, and to recognize that it is not enough to see the horror. We need to engage and we need to act. There are many here who have been involved over years and decades. There are many here who woke up terribly last February to experience the war in their own country and have been working to respond to that tragedy. From the Romanian Peace Institute, Patria, and all the allies involved in organizing this event, we want to thank all for what you are doing, whether that is working to respond to situations in your own communities and countries or to support an alliance with people globally. And we will continue to do all we can to practically and actively work to bring about an end to the invasion, occupation, and war in Ukraine, and work to build lasting, just, and effective security and peace, not only here in Europe, but in our world. Thank you very much to everyone who has joined us. Please come with your ideas for what we can do together in the future, or let us know what you're doing and how we can take part. We will continue to be the change that we need to see together in the world. Dziękuję, spasiba, mulțumesc, köszönöm. Thank you.